Close your eyes for a second and imagine a world that looks almost like ours, except it never quite left the 1950s. The cars are wide and chrome-heavy, running on fusion cores instead of gasoline. The music crackling out of every radio sounds like a barbershop quartet that doesn't know anything has gone wrong. The advertisements, plastered on every wall and billboard, show grinning families in pastel kitchens, holding up bottles of Nuka-Cola like they've just discovered the meaning of life. The men wear hats, the women wear pearls. The robots that sweep the floors and maintain the gardens are shaped like cheerful hunks of gleaming metal, designed to be approachable rather than threatening. Because who would be threatened by a robot that smiles? On the surface, everything looks wonderful. The surface is the important thing to maintain. Underneath, the world is quietly strangling itself. This is where the Fallout universe begins, not with the bombs, not with the ash and the ruin and the slow transformation of a continent into something unrecognizable, but with a long and slow unraveling that takes most of a century to reach its catastrophic conclusion. And the most frightening thing about the unraveling is how familiar it looks from inside it. The point where the Fallout world splits from our own is somewhere in the aftermath of the Second World War. While the real world moved toward transistor technology, silicon chips, and the digital revolution we know today, the alternate America of Fallout went a different direction entirely. Nuclear power became the great solution to everything. Fusion reactors the size of a small engine block could power an entire city block. Automobiles ran clean on fusion cells. Robots swept floors, assisted surgeons, and guarded government installations. The aesthetics of that post-war optimism, the gleaming kitchens, the robots, the cheerful advertising mascots never went away because there was no cultural earthquake to displace them. Punk rock never happened. Counterculture never took hold. The American dream calcified into something rigid and corporate and deeply strange, while the government quietly became something more sinister than anyone living inside it was comfortable admitting. By the early 2000s in the Fallout timeline, something the games refer to simply as the resource wars was already underway. Oil, the lifeblood of global industry, even in a world with fusion technology, was running out faster than any nation wanted to publicly acknowledge. The United Nations attempted to moderate the growing tensions between nations, fighting over what remained of the world's petroleum reserves. But by July 2052, the organization dissolved, entirely unable to hold together a coalition of countries that had all started prioritizing their own survival. The moment the UN collapsed, the pretense of international cooperation went with it. The European Commonwealth, a loose coalition of European nations that in the Fallout world never quite became the unified bloc we know in real life, went to war with the Middle East over oil. Those conflicts would grind on for years, devastating both regions and leaving Europe in a state of perpetual low-level military engagement. Meanwhile, the United States was taking its own aggressive steps to secure resources. In 2051, American pressure on Mexico began in earnest trade policies, economic leverage, and thinly veiled threats that were less about partnership and more about annexation in everything but name. By 2059, the United States had effectively secured Canadian oil supplies, and the relationship between the two countries had become something closer to occupation than alliance. Canadian citizens who pushed back found their protests met by U.S. military force. The formal annexation of Canada came in 2076, just a year before the world ended. What makes this history so quietly uncomfortable is how familiar it feels. The slogans about freedom and democracy never stopped. The propaganda never became less cheerful. Even as the government grew more authoritarian, even as civil liberties were gradually stripped away under the banner of wartime necessity, the advertisements kept selling the dream. Vault-Tec, the corporation at the center of everything that would happen later, ran commercials with bouncy music and cartoon mascots and hard hats, showing happy families descending into underground vaults. The pitch was simple. If the worst ever happens, we'll keep you safe. It was the most successful lie in the history of fiction. The United States in the decades before the war had quietly become something close to a corporate police state. The Enclave, a shadowy cabal composed of the highest levels of the American government, wealthy industrialists, and military brass, was already operating like a government within the government, planning for the scenario in which the surface world became uninhabitable and they, specifically they, would be the ones to rebuild it. The Societal Preservation Program, the official justification for the Vault network, was publicly framed as a humanitarian effort to protect as many Americans as possible. What it actually was, in the Enclave's private planning documents, was a data-gathering operation. The vaults weren't built to save people. They were built to study them. To understand what comes later, the ghouls, the super mutants, the factions, the wars across the wasteland, you have to understand the decades that built the pressure. The world didn't end because someone evil decided to push a button. It ended because dozens of overlapping systems all failed at once, because resources ran out and institutions crumbled, and governments that had been lying to their populations for years finally ran out of room to maneuver. The Sino-American War, which began in earnest in 2066, was the match that lit the fuse. China, facing its own resource crisis, made the decision to invade Alaska, specifically targeting the oil reserves there that the United States depended on. Alaska had strategic pipelines that fed a significant portion of American fuel needs, and China's military leadership calculated that cutting that supply would bring America to the negotiating table. They were wrong about the negotiating table part. The Battle of Anchorage became one of the defining military engagements in Fallout's pre-war history. American forces, equipped with the newly developed T-51 power armor, a powered exoskeleton that made individual soldiers into walking tanks, pushed back against Chinese forces in a grinding winter campaign that took years to resolve. The war in Alaska became a symbol of American resilience and technological superiority in the propaganda back home, even as it dragged on longer than anyone wanted to admit. Veterans came back changed. Post-traumatic stress disorder was common, and the VA hospitals were so overwhelmed that returning soldiers often received little more than a pamphlet and a handshake. The country thanked them loudly in public and forgot them the moment they were out of sight. Meanwhile, on the Chinese mainland, American expeditionary forces had opened a second front, fighting in Shanghai, the Gobi Desert, and near Nanjing. By 2076, the war had lasted a decade and settled into a brutal stalemate. Neither side was winning, but neither side could afford to stop. The resource crisis driving the conflict had not improved. If anything, it had worsened. The global economy was contracting. Trade routes that had operated for generations had collapsed. Countries that had once been stable were fragmenting into desperate splinter factions fighting over whatever was left. The Alaskan campaign finally concluded in January 2077, with American forces reclaiming Anchorage in what was celebrated back home as a great victory. But the victory felt hollow. The war on the Chinese mainland was still going. Shanghai had not fallen, and both sides had been escalating in ways that were difficult to walk back. American military research, driven partly by Vault-Tec, a massive defense contractor that had its hands in everything from power armor development to biological research, had been pushing the boundaries of what was acceptable in warfare. The forced evolutionary virus, which would go on to reshape the population of the post-war world, was being developed in Vault-Tec facilities under the guise of biodefense research. The actual goal was the creation of super soldiers. The results were something far stranger. By mid-2077, the intelligence coming into Washington was increasingly alarming. Reports of Chinese stealth submarines near American coastlines, unknown contacts off the Pacific coast, escalating nuclear rhetoric from both sides. The American government, never particularly transparent with its citizens, had become essentially opaque. Emergency broadcasts tested the national alert system with increasing frequency. Families quietly began stockpiling food and water, not because anyone officially told them to, but because the feeling in the air was something that didn't require an official announcement to understand. In the final months before October, a curious demographic phenomenon was happening across the country. Vault-Tec was selling. People who had laughed off the Vault advertisements for years suddenly found themselves calling the number on the screen. Lottery systems had been set up for most vaults. Not everyone could get in. There were limited slots and the waiting list swelled. What most applicants didn't know was that the selection process was far less random than it appeared. Vault-Tec was choosing its subjects carefully, seeding the populations with specific variables that would serve the experiments each vault was designed to run. Some people were selected for vaults designed to be functional. Most were selected for something considerably darker. The world of Fallout in the years leading up to the war is exhausting in a very specific way. It's a world that has all the trappings of comfort: shiny robots, cold Nuka-Cola, cheerful billboards wrapped around a core of institutional rot so deep that the rot had become structural. Every corporation was complicit. Every government department was compromised. The men and women who knew what was actually happening were either part of it or too afraid to speak. And the vast majority of the population, the people buying lottery tickets for vault spots, listening to the radio, watching their fusion-powered televisions, had no idea how completely they were about to be abandoned by the systems built to protect them. All of that history, all of that slow compression, would release in a single morning. Drop a comment below letting us know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. And if this kind of deep dive storytelling is your thing, hit subscribe so you never miss one. Part 2. The Great War and the Vaults. The 23rd of October 2077 began like any other Saturday. In Boston, a husband and wife were getting their young son ready for the day. In Los Angeles, a Hollywood actor named Cooper Howard was performing at a children's birthday party in a cowboy costume, signing autographs and posing for photographs while the kids climbed on him with the gleeful disregard children have for personal space. In Washington, D.C., government officials were reviewing the latest intelligence reports in secure facilities. In Appalachia, the stretch of mountains and forests covering what had been West Virginia, the occupants of Vault 76 were preparing for their scheduled reclamation day, 25 years in the future, unaware that the timeline was about to get drastically accelerated for everyone else. The alert came without warning for most people. Civil defense sirens started going off in city after city, and the emergency broadcast signal, that flat, mechanical tone that everyone recognized from decades of tests, cut across every radio and television channel simultaneously. Only this time, it wasn't a test. The sequence of events as recorded in Fallout lore began in the early hours of the morning. At approximately 3:30 in the morning, Eastern Standard Time, a squadron of high-altitude bombers was detected off the Bering Strait, believed to be Chinese. Unknown submersible contacts had already been picked up off the California coastline hours earlier. At least one Chinese stealth submarine, the Yangtze, whose unexploded warhead would eventually become a quest destination in Fallout 4, had moved close to the American East Coast, launching its payload with the exception of one missile that malfunctioned. By 9 in the morning, the Integrated Operational Nuclear Detection System had picked up the first confirmed missile launches, and the United States went to DEFCON 2. What followed was roughly 2 hours that ended the world. No one knows with certainty who fired first. That ambiguity is intentional. One of the franchise's recurring themes is that the causes of catastrophe are often murky and shared. That blame is rarely as clean as the survivors want it to be. What Fallout presents with quiet consistency is that the war was brief, overwhelming, and almost entirely without tactical meaning by the end. Cities that had existed for centuries were gone in minutes. The mushroom clouds that rose over the horizon blended into a sky that would be filtered by nuclear wind for years afterward. Highways froze mid-evacuation, full of people who had run out of time and road simultaneously. Military checkpoints that had been operating moments before were abandoned, the soldiers having received orders that became meaningless the instant the radio went silent. The vaults sealed. That much went according to plan, or rather, according to the plan that Vault-Tec's marketing materials had described. The great heavy doors, reinforced against nuclear blast and radiation, swung shut. The pumps activated. The filters hummed. And inside each of Vault-Tec's 122 underground installations, somewhere between a few dozen and a few hundred people found themselves sealed away from a world that was burning above them. What happened inside those vaults is, in many ways, the real story of Fallout. Vault-Tec had constructed its entire network under the justification of the Societal Preservation Program, a government initiative designed to maintain a viable American population in the event of nuclear war. The public-facing pitch was humanitarian. The private reality, buried in terminal entries and holotapes, scattered across all 6 games and the television series, was considerably more complicated. The vaults were laboratories. The people inside them were subjects. And Vault-Tec had designed each installation to test a specific variable in human behavior under controlled conditions. The experiments ranged from merely unusual to actively cruel. Vault 81, located just outside what had been Boston, was designed as a medical research facility. The inhabitants were meant to be unknowing test subjects for cures to every major human disease, with the treatments delivered through the vault's water and air systems without the population's knowledge or consent. The researcher assigned to run the experiments suffered a crisis of conscience and sabotaged most of the program before it could begin, which is why Vault 81 is one of the few functional, populated vaults the sole survivor encounters in Fallout 4. The experiment largely failed to activate, so the people inside it simply lived out their lives in something approaching normality. The one disease that escaped, a prototype mole rat variant, still haunts the lower levels. Vault 11, located in the Mojave Desert of Nevada, was considerably darker. The experiment there was built around coercion. Inhabitants were told that unless they selected one of their own to sacrifice every year, the entire vault would be killed by an automated system. This was a lie, but the vault's population had no way of knowing it. For 75 years, the residents of Vault 11 chose their sacrifices, and the process of choosing corrupted them in every way you might imagine. Early sacrifices were volunteers or criminals. Later ones were political enemies. The election systems they developed to manage the process were weaponized by factions within the vault. Entire governments rose and fell within those walls based entirely on the question of who would be the next to die. By the time only 5 survivors remained, they refused. They had decided, collectively, that they would not choose anyone else. The automated system responded by playing a pre-recorded Vault-Tec message that praised them for their commitment to human life and noted that the experiment was over. The door unlocked. The 5 survivors, rather than feel relief, chose to use the weapons they had gathered in their final defiance to kill themselves. So profound was their guilt over the decades of participation they had chosen over resistance. The bones of those 5 people can still be found in Vault 11 when New Vegas is explored. Vault 12, near what had been Bakersfield in California, was designed to study the effects of radiation on a controlled population. Vault-Tec ensured this happened by designing the vault's door so that it would never properly seal. Radiation leaked in from the moment the bombs fell. Most of the inhabitants became ghouls, humans whose bodies were so saturated with radiation that the normal process of cellular death was interrupted, leaving them alive but transformed, their skin necrotic and their lifespans extending indefinitely as long as they weren't exposed to additional harm. The ghoul city of Necropolis, which appears in the original Fallout, was built by the survivors of Vault 12 above their slowly irradiating shelter. Vault 101, outside Washington, D.C., had perhaps the most psychologically unusual design. Every other vault was planned to eventually open. The whole point of the societal preservation program, at least nominally, was that the population would eventually emerge to help rebuild. Vault 101's door was never scheduled to open. Not in 50 years, not in 100, not ever. The vault was stocked with parts sufficient to keep its systems running indefinitely, and the experiment was simply this. What happens to a human community that believes, absolutely and without any evidence to the contrary, that the outside world no longer exists? The answer, when the lone wanderer escapes through that door in Fallout 3, is that 200 years of total isolation produces a community so rigid and so afraid of change that a single person walking out can fracture the entire social structure. Vault 92, also in the capital Wasteland region, was a musician's vault specifically populated with famous musicians under the premise that their cultural knowledge should be preserved. The actual experiment involved subliminal audio signals designed to trigger violent psychotic episodes at regular intervals. The experiment ended with the population killing each other. When Fallout 3's lone wanderer visits, the vault is a ruin full of skeletons and overturned instruments. Vault 22, encountered in Fallout New Vegas, was a botany research facility that had been experimenting with plants capable of surviving in post-nuclear conditions. The plants survived. They evolved. By the time anyone finds the vault, it has been entirely overtaken by a species of spore-producing plant that kills intruders and reanimates their corpses as mindless drones. The research files are still intact, and the notes left behind by the scientists in their final days make for some of the most quietly terrifying reading in the franchise. Vault 11 is dark. Vault 92 is dark. But the vault experiment that the Fallout TV series eventually brings to the foreground, the 3-vault system of vaults 31, 32, and 33 in what had been the Los Angeles area, is dark in a more insidious way because it doesn't announce its cruelty immediately. It hides it under the appearance of a functioning, healthy community. The 3 vaults were designed by a Vault-Tec executive named Bud Askins as part of what he called Bud's Buds, a management training program for the post-war world. The concept was this. Vault 31 would be stocked with cryogenically frozen Vault-Tec middle managers, preserved in stasis so that they could emerge and provide leadership to the populations of Vaults 32 and 33, which were to be populated with normal applicants. The three vaults were connected, and inhabitants were encouraged to trade genetic material essentially to intermarry, so that the management candidates in Vault 31 would consistently be positioned to lead whichever community emerged from the three-vault cluster. It was a plan for perpetual corporate control, disguised as cross-community cooperation, hidden inside what looked from the inside like a genuine survival program. None of the people living in Vaults 32 and 33 had any idea they were participants in a decades-long corporate succession plan. Above all of this, on the surface of a continent that had just had nuclear fire walked across it like a broom, the world was changing in ways that would take generations to understand. Radiation had not simply killed, it had transformed. The survivors who had been caught in the blast zones without vault access were dying, yes, but some of them weren't dying. Some of them were becoming something else. The intense radiation exposure that killed most people, in rare cases, triggered a different biological process entirely. The ghoulification process that claimed the residents of Vault 12 was also happening on the surface, at a much larger scale, among the people who had simply had nowhere to go. And the forced evolutionary virus, developed at Vault-Tec, moved to Mariposa military base for testing, already leaked into the environment by the time the bombs fell, was beginning its own quiet work on the population. Mariposa's vats of green FEV solution, left running in an automated facility with no human oversight, were seeping trace amounts of the virus into the groundwater. The mutation it caused was slower and more unpredictable in low doses than it was in the deliberate exposure the scientists had been conducting, but it was working, reshaping the biology of everything it touched. Rats grew to the size of dogs. Dogs grew to the size of horses. Insects mutated into creatures from nightmare. The wildlife of the American Southwest, the Midwest, the Eastern Seaboard, all of it was being slowly pushed towards something new. The first years after the war were a time of extraordinary violence and extraordinary silence in equal measure. The cities were gone. The infrastructure was gone. What remained were scattered survivors trying to figure out what the rules were in a world that had stopped having them. Some people formed communities almost immediately, drawing on whatever social structures they could remember. Former military personnel were particularly good at this. They already had a template for hierarchy, for discipline, for the distribution of resources in chaotic environments. Some groups turned inward and became hostile to anyone who wasn't already one of them. Others built walls, literal and social, and waited. The animals that had survived the rad scorpions, the bloatflies, the yaoguai, the deathclaws, were discovering a post-nuclear ecosystem that had been cleared of the apex predators it used to have. In their place, new apex predators were emerging. Some of them were animals. Some of them were something that used to be human. The world was not recovering. It was becoming something different entirely. And in the ruins of the Mariposa military base, in a series of vats filled with glowing green liquid, the process that would eventually produce the super mutants was already running without oversight, without direction, and without any particular concern for what would emerge from it 2 decades later. Part 3. The Brotherhood of Steel Birth of an Order. In the chaos of the first weeks after the Great War, while most of the surviving population was focused on the immediate problem of not dying, one group of people was thinking about something longer term. Not immediately initially, they were as shell-shocked as anyone else, but the man who would eventually found the Brotherhood of Steel was someone who had been shaped by a specific kind of disillusionment that made him think in terms of structure and legacy even when the world around him had stopped making sense. Roger Maxson had been a captain in the United States Army, assigned as part of a security team sent to monitor a Vault-Tec research facility in California. In January 2076, his team, under the overall command of a Colonel Robert Spindle, was sent to oversee the research being conducted at the facility in the interest of national security. The work being done there was classified, and Maxson's team was told only what they needed to know to maintain perimeter security. What they weren't told was the nature of the experiments taking place inside. In January 2077, all the Vault-Tec research and its personnel were relocated to a newly constructed facility, the Mariposa military base, in an effort to increase operational security as the war with China escalated. Maxson and his soldiers moved with them, still serving as security, still not fully informed about what they were guarding. That changed in October of 2077, roughly 2 weeks before the bombs fell, when Maxson and his men discovered what was actually happening inside the facility. The Vault-Tec scientists at Mariposa had been using military prisoners as involuntary test subjects for the forced evolutionary virus. The prisoners had not volunteered. They had been told they were participating in medical studies. The reality was that they were being exposed to a biological agent with unpredictable effects on human physiology, and when the experiments produced results that were undesirable, subjects who died or who mutated in ways that couldn't be controlled, they were disposed of. The discovery shattered the morale of Maxson's unit almost immediately. Colonel Spindell, the commanding officer, suffered a complete mental breakdown. He would commit suicide 5 days later, leaving Maxson as the effective leader of the group. Maxson, meanwhile, did something remarkable under the circumstances. He didn't panic. He organized. He interrogated the chief scientist, a man named Anderson, on the nature and extent of the experiments. He documented what he found. And then, concluding that what had been happening at Mariposa was a crime against humanity conducted with government sanction, he ordered the execution of Anderson and most of the research team. On the 20th of October, 2077, 3 days before the bombs fell, Maxson declared his unit's formal desertion from the United States Army via radio. He sent the message to command and waited for a response. He received none. The U.S. Army, in the final days of the war, was occupied with matters considerably more pressing than a rogue security captain in California. 3 days later, the bombs fell. Mariposa military base survived the initial exchange. Its reinforced construction, designed to withstand conventional attacks, proved sufficient to blunt the worst of the nearby detonations. Maxson had already begun gathering the families of his unit at the base, sensing that what was coming was something none of them would be able to weather alone on the surface. When the emergency broadcasts began and the mushroom clouds rose on the horizon, those families were already inside. The weeks after the Great War were consumed with the immediate work of survival. Maxson organized supply runs, established security protocols, inventoried their resources. He also began doing something that might seem incongruous for a man dealing with an apocalyptic scenario. He started writing down a philosophy. The experiences at Mariposa had given him a very specific view of what had gone wrong with the old world. Technology, developed without ethical oversight, weaponized by governments and corporations against the very people it was supposed to serve, had produced the monsters in the vats, and had ultimately produced the bombs that ended everything. The lesson he drew from this was not that technology itself was dangerous, but that uncontrolled technology in the hands of people without the discipline to use it responsibly, was catastrophic. This philosophy would become the ideological foundation of the Brotherhood of Steel. The march from Mariposa to the Lost Hills bunker in California, known as the Exodus, was not a short or easy journey. Some soldiers under Maxson's command chose not to follow. Dennis Allen, a sergeant, led a splinter group that broke away during the march. Most of them died in the wasteland. The survivors who made it to Lost Hills, Maxson's core group, along with the soldiers' families, and eventually a contingent of scientists who had joined them during the journey, arrived at a pre-existing government bunker that could serve as a permanent home. It was at Lost Hills over the following years that the Brotherhood of Steel formally came into existence. The name itself was chosen deliberately, drawing on Maxson's sense of the weight of what they were building, not just a survival community, but an order with a purpose and a code. The structure he created drew on military hierarchy ranks like Knight, Paladin, Elder, a quasi-monastic commitment to the preservation of technology, scribes who documented and maintained technical knowledge, and an ideology centered on the idea that advanced technology should be controlled by those disciplined enough to use it responsibly. That last point is crucial for understanding everything the Brotherhood does across the entire Fallout timeline. The organization's relationship with technology is not purely acquisitive. It's not just that they want powerful things. It's that they have a genuine belief, rooted in Maxson's founding experience, that powerful technology in the wrong hands is what destroyed the world. From the Brotherhood's perspective, the solution to that problem is to ensure that the most dangerous technology in the wasteland is concentrated in the hands of the one group organized enough to keep it from being misused. Whether this makes them heroes or simply a different flavor of the same controlling impulse that built the Enclave is one of the central questions the franchise never quite stops asking. The early Brotherhood was also notably more community-minded than it would later become. In the first years after the Great War, Maxon's group actively helped the survivors they encountered, using their military equipment and training to protect wasteland communities from the new threats emerging from the changed landscape. As the organization grew and developed its theological layers, the preservation of technology as something close to community assistance gradually became secondary to the hoarding mission. By the time the first Fallout game takes place in 2161, the Brotherhood is already a closed order, suspicious of outsiders, and more interested in acquiring pre-war technology than in the welfare of the people living around them. Maxon himself died in 2135, fighting super mutants, after having lived to see the Brotherhood grow from a traumatized handful of soldiers into a genuine institutional force. His descendants would continue to lead the organization for generations, though the leadership quality would vary enormously. His grandson John Maxon would be the High Elder during the events of Fallout 1, trying to navigate a Brotherhood that had become too comfortable in its isolation. His great-great-grandson Arthur Maxon would eventually command the airship Prydwen over the Commonwealth in Fallout 4, having dragged the East Coast chapter back toward a militant, expansionist posture after years of drift under Owen Lyons. The Brotherhood's relationship to the Enclave is an interesting mirror. Both organizations trace their lineage to the pre-war government and military apparatus. Both believe they represent the legitimate successors to Old America. The difference is that the Brotherhood, for all its flaws, at least operates somewhat openly. You can find them, talk to them, join them, or fight them. The Enclave operates entirely in shadow until it chooses to act, and when it acts, it is always with the belief that everyone outside its protected circle is expendable. The Brotherhood hoards technology because they believe it should be controlled. The Enclave hoards power because they believe they are the only people worth having it. Both of these impulses, the controlling impulse and the eliminationist impulse, will wind their way through the entire rest of the Fallout timeline, recurring in different forms, in different factions, in different corners of the wasteland. They are the twin engines of Fallout's recurring tragedy. Meanwhile, in a more humble corner of the ruined California landscape, a much smaller story was beginning, the story of a group of people who just wanted clean water. Part 4. Fallout 1. The Vault Dweller's Journey. 2161. Vault 13 was built into a mountain somewhere in what had been California, designed to house several hundred people and to remain sealed for 200 years. It had food production, water recycling, everything a self-contained community needed. The Overseer, the designated leader of the Vault, maintained order with the combination of genuine administrative competence and the slow, grinding paranoia that tended to develop in closed communities that had been underground for 84 years. The immediate problem, as Fallout begins, is simple and terrifying in equal measure. The water chip, the component responsible for controlling and recycling the Vault's water supply, has broken. The Vault has a spare, or rather, it was supposed to have a spare. There is no spare. The Vault's water supply is failing, and without a replacement chip, everyone inside Vault 13 will die of dehydration within months. The Overseer's solution is to send someone out. One person, because sending more people risks depleting the Vault's resources further, and because the Overseer has a deeply pragmatic relationship with expendability. The person chosen is the youngest adult in the Vault in the canonical telling, a young man who has spent his entire life underground, who has never seen the sun except through whatever monitors and recordings the Vault archive contains, and whose knowledge of the world above is almost entirely theoretical. He is given a Pip-Boy, a wrist-mounted computer that can map locations, track quests, manage his inventory, and play radio stations if there are any still broadcasting. He is given the Vault jumpsuit and a meager collection of weapons. And then the great door opens and he steps out into a California that looks nothing like the California his parents' might have described. The landscape above Vault 13 is brown and dry and enormous. Radiation has killed most of the vegetation, replaced by scrub and dried grass and the occasional mutated cactus. The mountains that form the Vault's surroundings are scarred from old blast damage. The roads that once connected California's towns and cities are still there, cracked and overgrown, but they're the most navigable paths through the wasteland, because the old builders put them where the terrain was easiest and physics still works the same way it always did. The first communities the Vault Dweller finds, Shady Sands, Junktown, the Hub, are small and fragile in the way that most post-nuclear communities are small and fragile. Shady Sands would eventually grow into something genuinely important. the founding seed of the new California Republic, but in 2161, it's a walled settlement of a few hundred people growing crops and defending themselves against rad scorpions and the occasional raider incursion. The hub is bigger, the largest city in the region, built around a pre-war water tower that still functions and serves as a commercial hub for caravan trading between the scattered settlements. The people there are pragmatic in the way that people operating at the margins of survival tend to be. They're not cruel exactly, but they're not particularly warm either. Everyone is working an angle. The Vault Dweller finds the water chip. It's in Necropolis, the city of ghouls built on and around the ruins of Vault 12, the vault whose door never properly sealed. Getting there requires navigating the wasteland, dealing with the various factions and settlements encountered along the way, and encountering for the first time something that makes the water chip crisis feel almost minor by comparison: super mutants. The super mutants that appear throughout the original Fallout are not random mutations produced by radiation. They are manufactured. They are the product of the forced evolutionary virus and the still-running vats at Mariposa Military Base, now operating for 84 years under automated control and under the direction of a man who calls himself the Master. The Master's story is one of the most disturbing origin stories in the franchise. His real name was Richard Gray, a pre-war scientist who had been part of an expedition to Mariposa to investigate the mutant activity in the area. The expedition went badly wrong. Gray was knocked into one of the FEV vats at Mariposa and was presumed dead. He was not dead. The FEV worked on him differently than it had worked on the test subjects, perhaps because of the concentration, perhaps because of some particular quality in his biology, and over the course of months, he mutated into something that was no longer human in any straightforward sense. His body merged with the Mariposa infrastructure. His intelligence expanded, or perhaps warped, into something that could simultaneously process information on a scale no unaltered human could match, and yet had lost the capacity for the kind of empathy that might have made him hesitate at what he began planning. By 2161, the Master has been operating for decades. He has built an army. He calls it the Unity, and its purpose is the next stage of human evolution, at least as the Master defines it. His logic, when the Vault Dweller eventually confronts him in the cathedral in Los Angeles, is internally consistent in the way that the logic of someone profoundly and catastrophically wrong sometimes is. The surface world is dying. Unaltered humans are too fragile, too fractious, too limited to survive what's coming. The solution is transformation, the forced evolutionary virus, administered at scale, converting humanity into super mutants who are stronger, more durable, and, in the Master's vision, able to finally transcend the fighting and the tribalism that brought the old world down. What the Master doesn't know, and what the Vault Dweller can discover and use against him, is that the FEV sterilizes its subjects. Super mutants cannot reproduce. The Unity's endpoint is not a new civilization of enhanced humans. It's a single generation of sterile warriors who will die out within a human lifetime, taking whatever chance humanity has with them. When confronted with this fact, the Master does something unexpected. He believes it. He accepts the logic, and rather than deny the evidence, he destroys himself, triggering an explosion in the cathedral that kills him and the super mutant forces gathered there. The Mariposa military base itself, the source of the army, has its own confrontation. The lieutenant, the Master's field commander at the base, is a creature of pure function, efficient and brutal in the way that something shaped entirely by military purpose tends to be. His defeat closes the second chapter of the Vault Dweller's mission. What happens when the Vault Dweller returns to Vault 13 is the ending that has haunted Fallout players since 1997. The Overseer is grateful. The Vault is saved. The super mutant threat has been eliminated. And then the Overseer tells the Vault Dweller that they cannot come back inside. The reasoning is cold, and not without its own logic. The Vault Dweller has become something the Vault cannot absorb. They have seen the outside world, fought in it, made choices in it that the people inside the Vault's walls are not equipped to understand. If the Vault Dweller returns, their presence will inspire the younger Vault residents, the ones who haven't grown up in the shadow of loss and radiation, to want to see what's out there. And if the best and youngest of the Vault's population starts leaving, the Vault loses its future. The Overseer is not an evil man. He is a man making a choice that protects the many at the cost of the one, and the one is standing in front of him. The Vault Dweller walks back out into the wasteland. Alone. The door closes behind them. This is where the canonical story takes on its quietly devastating second chapter. The Vault Dweller doesn't die on the road, and doesn't become bitter in the way you might expect. Instead, they wander. They write in a journal. Eventually, they find other wanderers, people who, like them, have been shaped by the wasteland, but haven't been destroyed by it, and together they move north, into the hills of Northern California. They find a valley that can support a community. They build something. They name it Arroyo. The Vault Dweller eventually disappears from Arroyo. The journal they wrote, the Vault Dweller's memoir, is left behind as a founding document, a piece of history that their descendants will read and argue over and half mythologize, turning the story of a single person's impossible year into something approaching scripture. The tribe that grows from that original community calls them the Vault Dweller, capital letters, the way you'd refer to a legendary figure rather than a person. Their grandchild is the protagonist of Fallout 2. Part 5. Fallout 2, The Chosen One, and the Enclave, 2241. 80 years after the events of the first game, New California looks substantially different from the wasteland the Vault Dweller crossed. Communities have grown. Trade routes have been established. The hub is still operating. Shady Sands has grown into a genuine city, the capital of something calling itself the New California Republic, an attempt, imperfect and contested but real, to rebuild democratic governance in the post-nuclear landscape. The NCR has elections, a Senate, a flag. It collects taxes and fields an army and argues internally about its own policies, the way democracies tend to do. And in the hills to the north, Arroyo has become something quietly remarkable in its own right. It's a tribal village by this point. The technological knowledge that the Vault Dweller once carried has been partially lost and partially transformed into tradition, so that things that were once understood as science have become ceremony. The Vault jumpsuit is now a ceremonial garment. The Pip-Boy is a relic. The memory of Vault 13 is a sacred reference point rather than a geographical location. Arroyo in 2241 is suffering through the worst drought in anyone's memory. The crops are failing, the water sources are drying up. The village elder, the Vault Dweller's daughter, now a woman of substantial age and considerable dignity, has been reading about something called a Garden of Eden creation kit, a piece of pre-war Vault-Tec technology capable of terraforming a small area of wasteland into something arable. The GEC was supposed to be standard equipment in every vault, a tool for exactly this kind of post-war community building. Vault 13 was supposed to have one. There's only one way to find out. The Elder designates the Chosen One, her own son, the Vault Dweller's grandchild, as Arroyo's champion, sends them through the Temple of Trials to prove their worth, and then sends them out into the world with the Vault jumpsuit and a small number of caps and a very large problem to solve. What the Chosen One finds in the wasteland is a world that has recovered enough to be complicated. The NCR represents real political power. Vault City, a vault community that emerged with its technology largely intact, operates as an advanced enclave of prosperity in a region of poverty, and deals with the moral question of what you owe to the people outside your walls, with a combination of bureaucracy and denial. New Reno is exactly what you'd imagine New Reno to be, a city built on vice, controlled by a rotating cast of criminal families who have turned chaos into an art form. Redding is a mining town with a drug problem. Broken Hills has a population of super mutants trying to live alongside humans, negotiating with varying degrees of success. The question of whether transformation removes your membership in the species you came from? The Chosen One winds their way through all of this, searching for the GEC, picking up companions, developing skills, making the kinds of complicated choices that make Fallout 2 one of the most ethically layered games in the series. But while they are doing this, something is happening back in Arroyo. The Enclave has been watching. The Enclave, whose brief and catastrophic presence was hinted at but not fully explained in Fallout 1, is the secret government, the cabal of high-ranking officials, military officers, and corporate executives who had prepared for the Great War by positioning themselves outside the blast zones. They had oil rigs off the California coast. They had advanced technology, vertibirds, power armor that made the standard Brotherhood issue look primitive, and a genetic purity doctrine that they had been developing for decades. In the Enclave's ideology, anyone who has been exposed to significant levels of radiation or FEV is by definition genetically impure, mutants, not worth preserving. Their plan under President Dick Richardson is elegant in the way that plans built by people with no empathy for others tend to be elegant. The Mariposa military base VATS had been producing FEV for decades. The Enclave had been refining it. The modified version they developed, FEV Curling 1-3, was airborne. It would not infect anyone with clean pre-war genetics. It would kill anyone exposed to it who carried the kind of genetic markers that come from 80 years of radiation exposure and biological drift in the post-nuclear world. In other words, it would kill nearly everyone alive on the surface of North America. The Enclave planned to release it into the jet stream. They needed two things for their plan. First, they needed the ability to deploy the virus. Second, they needed test subjects to confirm the effectiveness of their modified formula subjects who represented the full range of genetic diversity in the current wasteland population. For the second requirement, they turned to Vault-13, which had been sealed for 200 years according to the original experiment parameters, producing a population that was clean by Enclave standards but had been in controlled isolation, providing useful baseline data. And they turned to Arroyo, whose tribal population represented the kind of wasteland genetic profile they needed to test the virus against. The Enclave attack on Arroyo comes while the Chosen One is still away searching for the Gek. Vertibirds come out of the sky. Enclave soldiers in advanced power armor, the kind that makes Brotherhood armor look like a starter kit, hit the village hard and fast. The defenders are no match. The village's people are taken. Hakunin, the village shaman, is left dying but alive, just long enough to tell the Chosen One what happened when they returned to find the village destroyed and the bridge demolished. The Chosen One's task has fundamentally changed. Finding the Gek was a mission of survival. Finding Arroyo's people is something more personal than that, and more urgent, because the alternative is not just personal loss, but the activation of a weapon capable of killing nearly every living person in the world who isn't the Enclave. The solution involves an oil tanker, specifically a pre-war tanker docked in San Francisco that still has enough structural integrity to make a journey, provided someone can repair its navigation systems and power it up. Getting there, finding the right people, completing the right tasks to make the ship viable, this is the back third of Fallout 2, a slow build toward a final confrontation that takes place on an offshore oil rig in the Pacific. The Poseidon Energy oil platform that serves as Enclave headquarters is enormous. Multiple levels, housing the president's office, the research labs, the armory, and deep in the bottom, the cells where the captured villagers of Arroyo and the displaced inhabitants of Vault-13 are being held as test subjects. Frank Horrigan, the Enclave's ultimate weapon, a man who has been so thoroughly augmented with power armor and experimental combat drugs that the distinction between the human and the armor has become philosophical patrols, the facility as its enforcer. He is one of the few characters in the franchise who has essentially no inner life to engage with. He is violence, wearing a face. The Chosen One fights through the facility, frees the prisoners, and eventually confronts both Richardson and Horrigan. Richardson dies without particular drama once the Chosen One reaches the presidential level. Horrigan requires considerably more effort, but the rig's reactor, once overloaded, handles the rest. The explosion that destroys the Enclave's oil platform is visible from the California coast. The surviving villagers of Arroyo and the released inhabitants of Vault-13 make their way back to land. Two branches of the same bloodline, the tribe and the Vault community, find themselves together for the first time, and with the Gek that the Chosen One recovered during their search, they rebuild Arroyo into something that can actually sustain them. The Chosen One becomes elder, presiding over the merged community with the kind of quiet authority that tends to come from people who have seen the worst of things and come back from it. The Enclave is gone, for now. The NCR is growing, and somewhere to the east, in the ruins of what had been the most powerful capital city in the world, something is happening in the irradiated streets that will eventually draw the attention of another soldier in another set of power armor from another faction. Part 6. Fallout 3. The Capital Wasteland, 2277. Washington, D.C., in 2277, is not a place that looks like a seat of power. The monuments are still standing. The Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, the ruins of the Capitol building, but they stand in a landscape of rubble and radiation, and a particular flavor of danger that feels different from the California wasteland. The super mutants in the Capital Wasteland are larger and more aggressive than their Western counterparts, a consequence of different FEV exposure patterns. The ghouls have organized in some areas and gone feral in others. And underground, in the metro tunnels that once carried commuters from suburb to suburb, Raiders, and worse, have established territories that make above-ground travel almost comfortable by comparison. The story of Fallout 3 begins not in this wasteland but in a vault. Vault 101 sits in the hills outside what had been the D.C. suburbs, and its population has been living underground for 200 years with the firm institutional belief that the door will never open and that the outside world no longer exists. Among the people born in Vault 101, in the year 2258, is the child who will become the lone wanderer born inside the Jefferson Memorial, actually, where their parents James and Catherine had been working on a scientific project before coming to the vault. Catherine died in childbirth. James took the child to Vault 101, striking a deal with the overseer to become the vault's resident doctor. The lone wanderer grows up knowing the vault's walls, its corridors, its politics, its gossip. Their father is a respected figure. Their childhood, which the game walks you through in an opening sequence, is structured and safe and small in the way that childhoods in contained spaces tend to be. When they are 19, everything changes. James disappears from Vault 101, without explanation, without warning. He simply leaves, which means he opens the great door that hasn't been opened in 200 years and walks out into a world the Vault's residents have spent 2 centuries pretending doesn't exist anymore. The social disruption this causes is significant. The overseer, a man named Amada's father, responds to the crisis by locking down the vault and sending security forces to find the lone wanderer, whom he correctly suspects knows more than they're saying. The lone wanderer escapes through the same door their father used, and steps out. The light. That's what everyone mentions when they describe the moment of emergence. The lone wanderer has spent 19 years in artificial lighting. The first real sunlight they've ever experienced hits them when the vault door opens, and the sky is enormous in a way that a person who has spent their life in corridors couldn't have been prepared for. Even if it's a damaged sky, filtered through decades of atmospheric debris, radiating from a sun that shines on a landscape of brown and gray ruin, it's still a sky. It's still out there. The immediate task is finding James. The wasteland outside Vault 101 includes Megaton, a circular settlement built around an unexploded atomic bomb that someone welded into a fountain for reasons that become less bizarre the longer you think about how communities make meaning out of whatever's available. The sheriff of Megaton, a man named Lucas Sims, keeps a degree of order. The Galaxy News radio station, hosted by a DJ called Three Dog, whose signal reaches most of the capital wasteland, is both an information source and the nearest thing to a community institution the region has. Three Dog points the lone wanderer toward Rivet City, a decommissioned aircraft carrier that serves as the capital wasteland's most significant settlement, anchored in the Potomac near what had been the Navy Yard. It is inside Rivet City that the search for James begins to make sense, because Rivet City is where James's colleagues work, and where the project he abandoned and then abandoned his life in the vault to return to has its base of operations. Project Purity. James and Catherine had been scientists working on a water purification system that, if it could be completed and activated, would purify the radioactive water in the tidal basin and the Potomac River. Clean drinking water is the most valuable resource in the wasteland. Not caps, not pre-war money, not technology water, pure and drinkable, without the radiation that makes even survival a slow dying. If Project Purity worked, it would represent the single largest quality of life improvement the capital wasteland had ever seen, for every person living in it. James was working on the project when Catherine died. Grief, and the need to protect the infant they'd had, made him abandon the work and disappear into Vault 101. 19 years later, something changed his mind. Or, more precisely, something he found changed his mind, a piece of pre-war technology called a Garden of Eden creation kit, identical in function to the one that the Chosen One retrieved in Fallout 2, hidden in a vault called Vault 112, where the scientist who ran it had been running a virtual reality simulation that kept the vault's inhabitants in a kind of waking sleep. James needed the Gek to complete Project Purity. He found it. And then he walked back to the Jefferson Memorial to try to finish what he and Catherine had started. The Enclave, despite the defeat of their oil platform off the California coast 4 decades earlier, has not disappeared. They have survived, reorganized, moved east. Under President John Henry Eden, whose presidential authority is real but whose physical presence is a chilling surprise, and his military enforcer, Colonel Autumn, The Enclave has established a new base at Raven Rock and has the resources, the weapons, and the ideology to pursue exactly the kind of plan you'd expect from the organizational successors of Dick Richardson's regime. When they discover that James has returned to the Jefferson Memorial to restart Project Purity, they move to take it. The confrontation at the Jefferson Memorial kills James. He chooses to flood the control chamber with radiation rather than allow the Enclave to take the project, an act of self-sacrifice that prevents Autumn from claiming it, but leaves Project Purity still incomplete and now under Enclave control. The Lone Wanderer escapes with the surviving scientists, including Dr. Madison Lee, to the Citadel, the Pentagon building that the Capital Wasteland Brotherhood of Steel has converted into its headquarters under Elder Owen Lyons. Owen Lyons is a Brotherhood elder unlike most who appear in the franchise. His chapter was sent east years ago to investigate pre-war technology rumors in the D.C. area, and somewhere along the way, Lyons made a decision that would cost him authority within the Brotherhood hierarchy, but would define what his chapter became. He decided that protecting the local population from the super mutant threat was more important than hoarding technology. This humanitarian stance had already created a schism within his chapter, the Brotherhood Outcasts, who left Lyons' command and established their own operations in the wasteland, loyal to the original Brotherhood mandate rather than Lyons' reinterpretation of it. But it also made Lyons' Brotherhood the only faction in the Capital Wasteland actually doing something for ordinary people. The war over Project Purity is also the war over the future of the Capital Wasteland. Who controls clean water controls everything. The Enclave has forces, technology, and the willingness to use it. The Brotherhood has Liberty Prime, a pre-war combat robot of enormous size, armed with a nuclear catapult and programmed with an anti-communist rhetoric that runs on a loop and provides an unintentional dark comedy backdrop to some of the most intense combat in the game. With Liberty Prime as their battering ram, the Brotherhood assaults the Jefferson Memorial in the game's final sequence, fighting through Enclave forces, while the Lone Wanderer navigates to the control room. At the end, the choice falls to the Lone Wanderer. Someone has to enter the radiation-flooded control chamber and activate the purifier. James's code, which he programmed into the system in his final moments, will start the process. But the radiation inside the chamber is lethal to an unprotected person. If no one enters, the Enclave will retake the facility. If someone enters, the water flows and whoever enters is unlikely to walk out again. The canonical resolution is that the purifier is activated. The explosion of ambient radiation that results knocks both the Lone Wanderer and Sarah Lyons, Elder Lyons' daughter and the leader of the Brotherhood's elite squad, unconscious. 2 weeks later, the Lone Wanderer wakes up in the Citadel, now a knight of the Brotherhood of Steel, with clean water flowing into the Potomac and the task of helping distribute it across the wasteland while hunting down Enclave holdouts. It is, in the context of a franchise about endlessly recycling catastrophe, one of the few unambiguous good endings in the series. Something was fixed. It stayed fixed. The water flows. Part 7. Fallout New Vegas. The Battle for the Mojave. 2281. 4 years after the events in the Capital Wasteland, and 2 decades before the events in the Boston Commonwealth, the most contested piece of real estate in the post-nuclear American Southwest is a city that was specifically designed to survive the apocalypse and largely succeeded. Las Vegas had always been built to be a destination rather than a home. Its economy depended on the arrival of visitors, not the rooting of communities. Robert Edwin House, an extraordinarily wealthy pre-war businessman with an IQ that his official documents coyly describe as perhaps the highest ever recorded, and a terminal illness he had been racing against for years before the bombs fell, understood this, and had spent the years immediately before the war preparing the city for a future he was fairly confident was coming. House's plan was elegant in its technical audacity. He had calculated, with reasonable precision, the date by which the resource wars would escalate into nuclear exchange. He was off by a few days on the specific timing, which meant that his system for intercepting incoming missiles was fully operational when they arrived, but not running at the 100% efficiency he'd intended. Las Vegas survived. Not unscathed, some warheads got through, and the suburbs were devastated, but the Strip, the city's central corridor of casinos and hotels, was largely intact. House, who had placed himself in a sealed life support pod to slow his illness while the systems he'd built ran the city on automation, watched his preparations pay off through cameras placed throughout the region. 200 and some years later, the city of New Vegas is a phenomenon. The Strip runs as it always did, lit up against the dark desert sky. 3 major casino hotels, operating under the management of 3 tribes that House recruited and rehabilitated: the Omertas, the White Gloves, and the Chairman, while House himself persists in his deteriorating body inside his tower, connected to the New Vegas mainframe through a network of iBots and interface systems, ruling the city with the particular combination of visionary intelligence and absolute authority that tends to produce either very good or very bad outcomes depending on who's running it. House intends New Vegas to be his contribution to the rebuilt world. Not just a city, a foundation for civilization. He has a plan for Hoover Dam, the massive pre-war hydroelectric installation on the Colorado River that is the primary power source for the region. He has a plan for the automated manufacturing facilities hidden in the surrounding desert. He has a plan, stretching across several decades of careful positioning, to use New Vegas as the economic and technological cornerstone of a new civilization that will, within a few generations, be capable of launching into space. Standing in his way are 2 competing powers. The new California Republic represents the most organized human political entity in the post-nuclear world. Founded from the community that grew from Shady Sands, the same Shady Sands that the Vault Dweller visited in Fallout 1, now grown into a major city, the NCR has elections, a military, taxation, and a genuine commitment to democratic governance, however imperfect its execution. By 2281, it controls much of California and has extended its reach into the Mojave wasteland, where it has been fighting a grinding, low-intensity conflict for years against the other major power in the region. Caesar's Legion is something different. Its founder, a man named Edward Sallow, who named himself Caesar and constructed an identity as a Roman emperor, was once a follower of the Apocalypse, a scholarly organization dedicated to preserving and disseminating knowledge in the wasteland. His exposure to classical texts gave him a framework for understanding post-nuclear society that was simultaneously intellectually serious and profoundly brutal. The Legion he built from a confederation of tribal groups absorbed and defeated over 2 decades is militarily effective, technologically Spartan, no energy weapons, no pre-war tech, just bodies and blades and disciplined brutality, and organized around an ideology of martial virtue that offers genuine security to the communities under its protection in exchange for the complete elimination of those communities' autonomy. In 2277, the Legion and the NCR fought their first major engagement at the Hoover Dam and the adjacent settlement of Boulder City. The Legion lost. Caesar's legate, a man named Joshua Graham, so thoroughly burned and thrown into the Grand Canyon afterward that his survival seemed impossible, was replaced by Lanius, a warrior of such physical and psychological ferocity that his appearance on a battlefield tends to be the last thing the other side sees. When Fallout New Vegas begins in 2281, the second battle of Hoover Dam is coming. Both sides know it. The entire region is coiling around that coming confrontation, and the courier, a person employed by the Mojave Express delivery service, has just been shot in the head, relieved of the platinum chip they were carrying, and buried in a shallow grave outside the small town of Good Springs. The courier is not dead. They are dug up by a robot named Victor, operated by the unseen hand of Robert House, who had been tracking the platinum chip and needed to know whether his courier had survived. The town doctor, a man named Mitchell, patches the courier's skull, extracts the bullet, one of 2 that Benny, a chairman gang leader and habitual backstabber, put there, and declares them improbably alive. The courier wakes up, is informed of what happened, and sets out to find Benny. What the courier is actually carrying, what Benny understood and what the courier will come to understand, is the key to New Vegas's future. The platinum chip contains an upgrade for the Securitron robots that guard the Strip, not just an enhancement but a fundamental shift in capability, turning them from competent guards into an army capable of holding New Vegas against any conventional force. House needs that chip to make his plan work. Benny stole it because he had a plan of his own, involving a prototype AI that he thought he could use to replace House and run New Vegas himself. The courier tracks Benny to the Strip. What happens next depends entirely on the choices the player makes, which is precisely what makes New Vegas the most thematically rich game in the franchise, because every faction has a coherent internal logic, and every choice has genuine consequences. In the NCR ending, the the Republic wins the Second Battle of Hoover Dam and extends its governance into the Mojave. It is the most stable outcome and the least inspiring. The NCR is not corrupt, but it is bureaucratic and stretched thin, and the history of empires suggests that stability purchased through institutional momentum tends to be temporary. In Caesar's Legion ending, the Legion takes the dam and the Strip, and Caesar's model of order through absolute authority is imposed on the Mojave. Peace follows, but it is the peace of suppression, and the women and minorities under Legion control pay for that peace in ways that make the trade-off starkly clear. In the Mr. House ending, the Courier helps House eliminate both the NCR and the Legion's forces at the dam, leaving New Vegas as an independent power under House's guidance. It is the most interesting outcome and perhaps the most ethically complicated. House's long-term plan is genuinely impressive, and he is not wrong that the NCR's bureaucratic sprawl is failing the people it claims to serve, but handing absolute authority to a single human being, however brilliant, is its own kind of fragility. In the wildcard ending siding with a free New Vegas, the Courier eliminates all three major powers and secures independence for the city under the management of Yes Man, an AI that will follow whoever controls it. This is the ending with the most uncertain future and the most satisfying immediate sense of having broken the cycle. None of these endings is Fallout's definitive answer to the question the game is asking. The question is simply, given what you know about human nature and institutional power, which of these imperfect futures do you want to build? And the silence of that answer, the fact that the game refuses to tell you which one is right, is what makes New Vegas's ending linger. Part 8, Fallout 76, the first generation, 2102. Rewind the clock by nearly 180 years. Back to the first generation after the Great War, when the ash was still settling, when the radiation was still hot, and when the most profound question a survivor could ask was whether anything worth building had survived. Vault 76 was different from most vaults in one significant way. It was designed to be opened, not indefinitely sealed, not running a behavioral experiment that would end in mass death or institutional collapse, but a genuine survival vault with a genuine exit plan. The people selected for Vault 76 were, according to Vault-Tec's documentation, the best and brightest available scientists, engineers, doctors, educators. The vault was positioned near what had been Washington, D.C., in the mountains of West Virginia's Appalachia region. Its opening was scheduled for 2102, exactly 25 years after the Great War. 25 years is long enough for the immediate radioactive danger to settle somewhat, but short enough that there are still living people outside who remember the world before. Reclamation Day, as the Vault called it, was intended to be the beginning of organized recovery efforts. The Vault's overseer would guide the process of recolonization and community building. What the overseer found when the door opened was an Appalachia that had changed in ways the planning documents hadn't fully anticipated. The mountains were still there. The rivers were still flowing, though the water quality varied enormously. The old towns, Flatwoods, Morgantown, Charleston, still stood in varying degrees of ruin, and the wildlife had become something categorically different from what anyone who left the vault as a child would have known. Fallout 76 occupies a unique position in the timeline because it's the first chronological story. The events of the game predate the Vault Dweller's journey by nearly 60 years, and it fills in crucial background about how the post-war world began to take shape in the eastern part of North America. Some of the factions that appear in later games are either newly formed or barely emerging here. The Brotherhood of Steel, for instance, appears in Fallout 76 in what is essentially its first expedition east of its California origins. A group sent to Appalachia under a paladin named Taggarty, a friend of Roger Maxson from before the war, in response to a specific threat that the mountains of West Virginia had generated. That threat is the Scorched Plague. The Scorched are humans who have been infected by a particular strain of spore-producing fungus that has mutated in the post-nuclear environment and taken on characteristics that make it something considerably worse than a simple infection. The Scorched are not zombies in the conventional sense. They retain some capacity for using weapons, for coordinated action, but they are driven by the infection rather than by anything that could be called intention. They spread the plague by proximity, and wherever the plague spreads, it spreads faster. The worst version of the Scorched threat is the Scorch Beast, massive creatures that appear to be severely mutated bats, carrying and amplifying the plague, flying in groups that can devastate entire regions. The Scorch Beast Queen, the matriarch of the species and the climactic threat in the base game's main story, is large enough and durable enough that defeating her requires not just individual player capability, but the tools left behind by a pre-war group called Atlas, a defense research program that the Vault's overseer spent the early months of Reclamation Day trying to understand and reactivate. The story of Fallout 76, and it does have a story, whatever early reviews suggested, is fundamentally about inheritance. The Vault dwellers who emerge in 2102 are inheriting a world that the previous generation shaped for reasons they can only partially reconstruct from terminal entries and holotapes left behind by people who are now dead. The humans of Appalachia have largely died out in the years before the Vault opened, leaving behind their technology and their mistakes and their fragmentary explanations, and the Vault dwellers have to piece together what happened while also dealing with the immediate threat of the Scorched. The faction landscape in Appalachia includes the Free State's libertarian survivalists, who prepared for the war earlier and more independently than most, the Responders, a community built by first responders who survived the war and tried to continue their mission of helping people, the Enclave, whose presence in Appalachia is a fascinating look at a version of the organization before its California defeat, and the Brotherhood of Steel's first Appalachian chapter. The Brotherhood's presence in West Virginia ends in tragedy, in the way that first chapters of grand organizations often do. Taggarty's group, despite significant capability and dedication, is eventually overwhelmed by the scale of the Scorch Beast threat. Their last transmissions are preserved in the game's lore, and they are documents of people who fought hard for something they believed in and ran out of time before they could finish it. The Brotherhood of Steel's Appalachian chapter is effectively extinct by the time later vaults begin opening. Their legacy, their equipment, their bases, their records, is what the Vault dwellers of Vault 76 inherit along with everything else. The later expansions to Fallout 76 expand the timeline and introduce the elements that will eventually bridge to the larger franchise. Wastelanders, the major expansion set in 2103 and 2104, brings human NPCs back to Appalachia in numbers, as the region slowly becomes habitable enough to attract settlers again. A new Brotherhood chapter arrives, sent from the west, setting up the presence that will eventually grow into something players of the later games will recognize. The settlers and raiders of Wastelanders establish social dynamics in Appalachia that look, in miniature, like the same dynamics that will play out in the NCR and the Legion decades later, the desire for stability versus the desire for freedom. The question of who gets to define what counts as civilization. Appalachia, in 2102 to 2105, is a world still in the process of becoming. Its particular horror is not the monumental darkness of the war itself, but the loneliness of aftermath, the emptiness of streets where people used to live, the silence of terminals where hands used to type, the sense that everything that was built here was built by people who tried very hard and didn't quite make it. Walking through Flatwoods or exploring the remains of Charleston, reading the last notes that the responders left for the people they hoped would come after them, has a specific quality that the later games don't quite replicate. It feels like reading a letter that was never delivered. Part 9. Fallout 4. The Commonwealth and the Institute. 2287. Boston in 2287 is not Boston, as anyone who lived there before the 23rd of October, 2077 would recognize it. The harbor is still there, and some of the old buildings still stand, their bones visible through the accumulated damage of 2 centuries. But the Commonwealth, as the post-war population calls what remains of Massachusetts, has developed in a particular and unsettling way, shaped by the presence of an organization so secretive and so powerful that most of the people living in its shadow aren't entirely sure it exists. The sole survivor begins the game in the last minutes before the bombs fall. This is something the franchise had never done before, given the player direct, experiential access to the world before the war. The opening sequence of Fallout 4 is set on the morning of the 23rd of October 2077 in a suburb of Boston. The sole survivor, either a retired Army veteran named Nate or a lawyer named Nora, depending on the player's choice, is living the ordinary life of an ordinary pre-war family. There's a child, there's a spouse, there's a breakfast table, there's a television playing an advertisement for Vault-Tec, there's a knock at the door. A Vault-Tec representative confirms that the family is approved for Vault 111, which is located nearby. Minutes later, the emergency broadcast comes through. The family runs. The scene of pre-war civilians running for Vault 111 while military personnel direct traffic and the mushroom clouds rise over Boston Harbor, is the most visceral depiction of the Great War in any of the games. And it grounds everything that follows, in a way that the lone wanderer's birth in the vault or the courier waking up in a grave never quite could. You see what was lost. You see what you are a survivor of. Inside Vault 111, the family is told there's a processing delay. They're put in cryogenic pods. The pods seal, and then they don't open, not in a few days, not in a few months. They stay closed for 210 years. During those 210 years, the sole survivor watches, from inside their pod, an event they cannot prevent. A group of men in advanced hazmat suits enters the vault, opens the pods of the spouse and child, takes the child, a boy, the sole survivor's son, and kills the spouse when she resists. The pod reseals. The cryogenic sleep continues. When the sole survivor finally emerges from their pod in 2287, they are the only person in the vault who is still alive. The other residents, whose pods malfunctioned over the decades, have died in their sleep. The facility is abandoned. The Commonwealth, when the sole survivor finally reaches the surface, is bright and enormous and utterly foreign. A landscape they have no mental framework for, despite being, in biological terms, the same person who stood in a Boston suburb watching mushroom clouds 2 centuries ago. The search for their son defines the first and second acts of the game. It leads the sole survivor through Diamond City, a settlement built inside Fenway Park, the old baseball stadium, its walls providing protection. The Commonwealth's residents have been grateful for, over generations, through a network of factions and characters and settlements, and eventually to the discovery of what happened to their son and who took him. The Institute is the most technologically advanced organization in the entire Fallout franchise at the time Fallout 4 takes place. Founded by the survivors of MIT's technical community, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, whose pre-war research had been among the most advanced in the country, the Institute has operated in secret beneath the Commonwealth for more than 150 years. Its location is unknown to surface dwellers because it teleports people in and out using a molecular relay rather than using any surface entrance. Its people are well-fed, climate-controlled, and working on problems that the surface population can't even conceptualize, while the surface population digs through ruins for canned food. What the Institute makes primarily is synths. The first generation of synths were simple robots, mechanical constructs that served specific functions. The second generation were more sophisticated, more humanoid. The third generation, the current generation at the time of Fallout 4, are biologically indistinguishable from humans. They have human musculature, human skin, human faces. They can eat, sleep, bleed. Their memories can be programmed. Their behavioral parameters can be adjusted. And they can be sent to the surface to infiltrate communities, replace specific individuals, gather intelligence, or simply live among the population as a form of controlled observation. The question of what a third-generation synth is, whether it is a person, whether it has rights, whether its constructed origin means that its experiences and feelings and apparent consciousness are any less real, is the central ethical question of Fallout 4, and it is a genuinely difficult one rather than a rhetorical one. The Institute says synths are tools. The Railroad, a secret organization that mirrors the historical Underground Railroad in function, says synths are people and operates an escape network to free them from Institute control and give them new identities in the Commonwealth. The Brotherhood of Steel, under Elder Arthur Maxon, a young man, the last of the Maxon line, who was sent east as a child and grew up in the Citadel, and eventually reunited the fractured Brotherhood chapters with something between genuine leadership and iron will, says synths are abominations and that the Institute is an existential threat to humanity. The Minutemen, a volunteer defense organization that was strong once and has been reduced by years of infighting and defeats to a handful of survivors, led by a man named Preston Garvey, are trying to rebuild the communities of the Commonwealth and mostly just want the Institute to stop replacing people and destabilizing everything. The sole survivor's son, Sean, is the Institute's director. He is, due to the cryogenic sleep that paused the sole survivor's aging, now decades older than his parent. He grew up in the Institute, was shaped by it, believes in its mission with the conviction of someone who has never known anything else. And the sole survivor, after spending most of the game's narrative searching for him, has to decide what to do with the knowledge that their child is both the person they were looking for and the leader of the organization they may be fighting. The choices the game offers are not clean. Every faction has done things that make alliance with it morally complicated. The Brotherhood is capable and organized, but approaches the synth question with a brutality that erases the ethical complexity entirely. The Railroad is admirably principled, but is fighting a battle so far outclassed in resources that its victories tend to be local and fragile. The Minutemen are the most genuinely community-minded option but have the least power. The Institute offers the most stability but demands the sole survivor become the instrument of an organization that has, by any reasonable reckoning, spent 150 years terrorizing the people living above it. What the Commonwealth looks like after the game's events depends entirely on which faction the sole survivor chose. The Institute is destroyed in all but one ending. The Brotherhood may or may not maintain a presence in Boston. The Minutemen may or may not be a viable defense force. The Railroad may or may not have established synth freedom as a reality rather than a hope. Clean water, in the Commonwealth, is already flowing. The rivers aren't the Potomac, and Project Purity happened a decade ago in a different state, but the principle of things getting marginally better is intact. The DLC expansions add pieces to the picture. Far Harbor, set on an island off the coast of Maine, explores the Children of Adam, a religious faction that venerates radiation as a divine force, and the specific tragedy of a synth who doesn't know she's a synth, and whose discovery of the truth is handled with more nuance than you'd expect from a game that also features you fighting hordes of robots in power armor. Nuka World, the most tonally dissonant of the expansions, sends the sole survivor to a pre-war theme park that's been taken over by a raider confederation and asks whether the settlement-building framework of the main game can be used to establish raider control over the Commonwealth's communities, an option the game allows and doesn't editorially punish, leaving the moral weight entirely on the player. Part 10. The Fallout TV series A New America, 2296. 9 years after the events of Fallout 4, the story moves west, back to California, back to the region where the franchise began, but to a California that has changed substantially in the intervening decades, and whose history has been shaped by events that the Amazon Prime series begins to reveal with the particular pleasure of a story that has been keeping its cards close for a long time. The show premiered in April 2024, and its success was immediate in a way that game-to-television adaptations rarely manage. It captured something that the games had always had: the tonal balance between genuine horror and dark comedy, the sense that the wasteland was both brutal and absurdly funny in ways that didn't cancel each other out, and it delivered it through 3 central characters whose perspectives were different enough that their collision produced genuine story. Lucy McLean is the most recent of the franchise's long line of Vault-emerged protagonists. She comes from the 3 Vault system, Vaults 31, 32, and 33, in what had been the Los Angeles area, and she has grown up with all the optimism and earnestness that a good Vault education and a genuinely loving family can produce. She believes in people. She believes in doing the right thing. She believes, with the particular conviction of someone who has never been seriously tested, that the wasteland can be approached with the same fundamental good faith that she brings to her interactions in the Vault. The wasteland has some thoughts about that. The ghoul, whose real name is Cooper Howard, is perhaps the most fully realized character in any piece of Fallout media. Before the war, he was a Hollywood actor who made cowboy films and did corporate appearances for Vault-Tec, while quietly becoming uncomfortable with the things he was learning about the organization he was promoting. He was, in 2077, a man whose career was declining, whose marriage to a Vault-Tec executive named Barb was fracturing under the weight of their differing commitments, and who genuinely loved his daughter in a way that the collapse of everything else around him made feel like the last solid thing in his life. 219 years of surviving in the wasteland have changed him in every way you'd expect and some ways you wouldn't. He's a ghoul. The radiation has done to him what it does to those who survive it in that particular way, leaving him functional and indefinitely lived but physically transformed. He operates as a bounty hunter. He is pragmatic about violence in the way that someone who has survived for 2 centuries by necessity rather than pleasure tends to be. And he remembers the old world in ways that give his cynicism a specific texture. He's not nihilistic, not exactly. He just has a very clear view of the gap between what people say they are and what they actually do. because he's watched that gap open and close and open again across 219 years of human behavior. Maximus is a squire in the Brotherhood of Steel, young and ambitious and shaped by the particular institutional culture of an organization that raises its recruits from childhood into something between soldiers and monks. He believes in the Brotherhood's mission in the way that people who have only ever known one set of values tend to believe completely, until the first time that complete belief runs headlong into a situation the values don't account for. His arc in the first season is about the painful process of developing a self that exists outside the institution, a process the Brotherhood is not designed to facilitate. The crisis that sends Lucy out of the vault involves the abduction of her father, the overseer Hank McClane. Raiders raid the vault, an event that should be nearly impossible given the vault's security, which raises questions that the season's narrative begins slowly answering. Hank is taken by a woman named Lee Moldaver, who has her own reasons for wanting access to him, reasons that connect to the larger conspiracy running beneath the surface of the show's story. That conspiracy involves Vault-Tec at a level that goes even deeper than the experiments the games have previously documented. The show's flashbacks cutting between 2296 and the months before the 23rd of October 2077 reveal that Vault-Tec executives, including Barb Howard, knew the bombs were coming and had made arrangements not just for the vaults but for something considerably more controlled. The decision of who would launch the first strike, it is implied in the season's most disturbing reveal, was not China or a rogue military actor or the result of the kind of cascading error that starts most accidental wars. The evidence points toward Vault-Tec, toward the corporation that built the shelters, the corporation that ran the experiments, making the apocalyptic calculation that a war was coming eventually and that it was better for their plans to control when it happened. This revelation is not presented as definitive fact. Fallout has always been careful to maintain some ambiguity about the Great War's origins, but it is presented with enough specificity to be unsettling in a way that goes beyond the franchise's previous treatments of Vault-Tec's cynicism. The major set piece of the first season's final episodes is the discovery of what happened to Shady Sands. In the games, Shady Sands grew from the small settlement the Vault Dweller visited in 2161 into the capital city of the new California Republic, the most significant attempt at democratic governance in the post-nuclear world. The NCR's fate after the events of Fallout New Vegas was one of the franchise's major unresolved questions. The games never definitively answered what happened to the Republic after the Second Battle of Hoover Dam, whichever faction won it. The TV series answers this question with a piece of environmental storytelling that lands like a quiet punch. A crater. Shady Sands is gone. The city that the Vault Dweller helped seed, that the Chosen One's actions helped build, that grew into a democratic capital over the course of a century, was destroyed at some point between 2281 and 2296. A bomb hit it. The city is rubble. The republic that the NCR represented is fractured, its remnants scattered across the wasteland in various states of disarray and denial. The show does not immediately explain who was responsible. The answer comes in pieces, and it involves Hank McClane in ways that reveal the 3 Vault Systems management program in its full scope. The Buds corporate succession plan has been running, and the men it was running have been making decisions about the outside world from inside the vault for decades. Season 2 of the show, which premiered in December 2025 and has already been renewed for a third, moves the story to New Vegas and the Mojave, introducing the remnants of the NCR Legion conflict and beginning to show what the Mojave wasteland looks like in 2296, 15 years after the Second Battle of Hoover Dam, long enough for whatever outcome was chosen to have produced consequences. Caesar's Legion is still a presence. The ruins of New Vegas are still there, and the questions about who controls the future of the American Southwest have not been answered, only complicated. The show's success has reignited the entire franchise. Player counts for Fallout 4, Fallout 76, and even Fallout New Vegas spiked dramatically in the weeks after Season 1 premiered. The games are part of the conversation in a way they weren't before, not as historical curiosities or beloved relics, but as ongoing texts, still being read, still being argued over, still generating genuine heat and discussions about what they mean. What the Fallout franchise means, taken as a whole, across all of its entries and now its television continuation, is difficult to reduce without losing something important. It is partly about American mythology, the way America tells stories about itself, the gap between the dream and the reality, the recurring national temptation to believe that the right institution, or the right leader, or the right ideology can solve the fundamental problems of human nature. It is partly about ecology, about what happens when a civilization consumes more than its world can provide. It is partly about inheritance, what we build, what we destroy, and what the people who come after us are left to make of the rubble. But mostly, at the level of individual experience, it is about people, the vault dweller, walking out into the California sun for the first time, the chosen one, returning to find their village gone, the lone wanderer, hearing a DJ call them by a name that means alone, the courier, waking up from a bullet to the head with a very long to-do list, the sole survivor, stepping out of cryogenic sleep into a world that has moved on without them by 2 centuries. Lucy McLean, emerging from Vault 33 with a smile and a canteen and the absolute certainty that things are going to be fine, and then learning what fine actually requires. Every one of these people inherits a broken world. Every one of them makes choices about what to do with the pieces. And the franchise, across every medium it's occupied, refuses to tell you whether any of those choices were the right ones, because the point isn't the choice. The point is the choosing. The point is that in a world where every institution has failed and every system has been revealed as a lie, the human thing, the specifically and irreducibly human thing, is to keep going, to pick up the pieces, to try again. The bombs will fall in October of 2077 in a world that looks like a chrome-plated fever dream of the American 50s. And 200 years later, the wasteland will still be full of people building settlements, running caravans, arguing over water purification, collecting bottle caps, and occasionally stopping to drink a Nuka-Cola that's been sitting in a destroyed convenience store for 2 centuries. That's Fallout. That's always been Fallout. The world ends, and then slowly, messily, with great loss and occasional absurdity, it keeps going. The story isn't over. It never is. If you made it all the way through, leave a comment with your favorite Fallout game or character, or just let me know where in the world you drifted off to sleep tonight. And if you want more of this kind of deep, slow, immersive storytelling, hit subscribe. There's a lot more world left to explore. Sleep well. Script for Qplay's ASMR, the entire timeline of Fallout to fall asleep. Part 1, continued. The world before the war. The culture that built the bomb. The divergence between our timeline and Fallout's is not simply technological. Technology is a symptom. The deeper divergence is cultural, and it runs through everything from the advertising language to the architecture to the way people in the Fallout world understand their relationship to their government. In our timeline, the post-war decades produced an enormous amount of social friction. The civil rights movement challenged the comfortable myths of American democracy and forced an ongoing, painful, still unfinished renegotiation of who was included in the national project. The Vietnam War produced a generation of veterans who came home to a country that struggled to honor what they had experienced, and that struggle produced its own cultural ruptures. Environmentalism emerged as a serious political force in the late 1960s and 1970s, driven by the growing evidence that industrial civilization was imposing costs on the natural world that the natural world might not be able to absorb indefinitely. None of this happened in the Fallout universe. The cultural landscape of 2077 Fallout America is recognizably descended from 1955 Fallout America, which is recognizably descended from the idealized version of American domesticity that the post-war economic boom made available to some Americans, and that the advertising industry sold to everyone. The women in the advertisements are always wearing pearls. The families are always gathered around the television. The robots are always cheerful. The Nuka-Cola is always cold. This is not accidental. The absence of cultural disruption is itself a consequence of the same forces that kept the technology pointed in a specific direction. A government that gradually became more authoritarian didn't encourage the kind of challenge to authority that produces social movements. A corporate media environment that was always selling the same dream didn't develop the countercultural voices that challenged that dream. The people who might have been the critics and the reformers and the voices of the margins were the same people who found themselves edged out of the institutions that produced public discourse, not through any single dramatic suppression, but through the accumulated weight of a system that was optimized to maintain itself. Nuka-Cola is worth spending a moment on because it captures the Fallout aesthetic in miniature. It's a soft drink. It's been the most popular beverage in North America for decades before the bombs fall. It comes in an iconic bottle curved, with a distinctive blue label that features the company's Atom logo and the image of a cheerful Nuka-Cola girl. It tastes, by all in-game accounts, exceptional. It's also mildly radioactive, thanks to a compound called strontium-90 that was added in 1962 to give the drink a slight glowing effect at a time when nuclear power was exciting rather than alarming. This radioactivity is not significant enough to cause acute harm from normal consumption. It is, however, present, and the company knows it's present, and the company continued selling the drink for decades after knowing, because the alternative was admitting that their product had a problem, and the corporate calculus of the era didn't accommodate that kind of honesty. The Nuka-Cola Corporation is one of the most successful companies in Fallout's pre-war America, and its success is instructive. It operates in the space between what is technically true about its product and what is advantageous to communicate about its product. And it fills that space with advertising that is not quite lying, but is also not telling you anything you wouldn't want to hear. This was standard business practice in the Fallout world, and it applied not just to soft drinks but to everything from automotive safety to pharmaceutical side effects to the terms of Vault-Tec's contracts. Vault-Tec's contracts are worth examining specifically because they represent the most consequential piece of consumer fraud in the history of human civilization. The people who signed up for Vault spots were entering into an agreement that was presented to them as a safety agreement. You pay us, we guarantee you a spot in a nuclear shelter, we keep you and your family safe if the worst happens. The agreement that Vault-Tec was actually entering into, from the company's perspective, was considerably different. You pay us, you agree to participate in our experimental program, and the nature of that program is not something we're going to disclose to you, because disclosure would compromise the experimental validity. The legal framework that allowed this existed because the Vault-Tec contracts, written by lawyers who understood what they were doing, contained provisions that effectively waived the applicant's rights to information about the nature of the experimental program. These provisions were buried in language that the signing parties were unlikely to fully parse and were formatted in ways designed to minimize scrutiny. Standard practice in the pre-war world. Standard practice in a world where consumer protection law had been quietly gutted over the course of 3 decades by a government that was simultaneously dependent on corporate campaign contributions and ideologically committed to the position that regulations were impediments to the freedom and prosperity that the American dream promised. The men and women who built the Fallout world's pre-war corporate government complex were not, for the most part, mustache-twirling villains. They were people who had made a series of individually defensible decisions within a system that rewarded those decisions and penalized the alternatives. The Vault-Tec executive who approved the experimental parameters for Vault 11 was someone who had convinced themselves that the data being generated was genuinely important for the long-term survival of humanity, and that the people in the vault were part of something larger than themselves, whether they knew it or not. The government official who signed off on the FEV research at West-Tec had been told, accurately, that the research could produce military advantages in the Sino-American War that would save more lives than the research cost. The politicians who voted to approve the annexation of Canada had been told accurately that the resource access it secured would prevent the kind of economic collapse that would cost many more lives than the occupation. The system produced terrible outcomes not because the people in it were uniformly terrible, but because the incentives were arranged in a way that consistently made terrible outcomes the locally rational choice. This is the political economy of the apocalypse, and Fallout's consistent genius is that it never quite lets you forget that the world didn't end because of evil. It ended because of logic, the logic of systems optimized for the wrong things, running without sufficient friction until the friction ran out entirely. The resource wars that form the backdrop for the final decades before the Great War are, in retrospect, exactly what they look like. Nations that had built their prosperity on finite resources, reaching the point where the resources were no longer sufficient to support the prosperity, and responding by competing violently for what remained, rather than collectively managing the transition to something else. The European Commonwealth's wars in the Middle East, the United States' annexation of Canada, the Sino-American War over Alaskan oil. None of these conflicts had a winner in any meaningful sense. They were all expressions of the same underlying logic. There is not enough, and the way we respond to there not being enough is to try to take from others before others take from us. By 2072, 5 years before the bombs fall, The global oil supply had dropped to approximately 1% of its pre-war levels. This number, cited in some of the game's loading screens, is so extreme that it requires a moment to absorb. 1%. The vehicles still ran because they ran on fusion power rather than internal combustion. The electricity still worked because the nuclear power plants were operating. But the specific functions that petroleum-served lubricants, plastics, certain chemical industrial processes were collapsing, and the supply chains dependent on those functions were collapsing with them. Manufacturing was disrupted. Food production, which depended on agricultural machinery that required lubrication to function, was becoming more expensive and less reliable. The global economic system was contracting in ways that were beginning to be felt in daily life, even in the comfortable suburbs of the American dream. In this context, the vaults were not merely an experimental program. They were also, from the Enclave's perspective, the mechanism through which the people worth saving would be preserved, while the people not worth saving were exposed to the consequences of the war. The people selected for vaults were, from one angle, the lucky ones. From another angle, they were the subjects. From the Enclave's angle, they were both useful precisely because they were lucky enough to have survived in a controlled environment, which made them the baseline against which the modified FEV's effectiveness could be measured. The pre-war world's most significant legacy is not its technology. The power armor and the robots and the fusion reactors are important. Yes, they shape the wasteland's possibilities in ways that reverberate through the entire franchise. But the most significant legacy is structural. The way that the pre-war world organized power and information and accountability produced a set of fault lines that didn't disappear when the bombs fell. They became the blueprint for the post-war factions. The Enclave is the pre-war government, preserved. The Brotherhood of Steel is the pre-war military, transformed. The Institute is the pre-war research university, sealed underground. The NCR is the pre-war democratic idealism, reconstructed from memory and trying to work despite everything. The bombs didn't end the argument about how to organize human civilization. They just reset the score. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you're enjoying this journey through the wasteland, hit subscribe before you fall asleep. Part 2. Continued. The Great War. What the Ruins Remembered. The 2 hours that ended the world produced, across the continent of North America, a specific kind of aftermath that the pre-war planners who had gamed out nuclear exchange scenarios had partially anticipated and substantially underestimated in its human texture. They had anticipated the casualties. Models had been run, scenarios had been assessed, and the military and governmental planners who had access to those models understood, in the abstract, that a full nuclear exchange between the United States and China would produce casualties in the hundreds of millions within hours and would transform the survivability conditions across most of the continent. They understood radiation dispersal, atmospheric effects, the disruption of food and water supply chains, the collapse of medical infrastructure, the challenges of maintaining social order in a context where communications had failed and the normal mechanisms of authority had been interrupted. What they had not adequately modeled, what might be impossible to adequately model, because it is not primarily a logistical or strategic question, was what it would feel like for the people in it. The texture of survival in the first hours and days and weeks. The specific quality of trying to find other survivors in a landscape that had been organized around the assumption of their presence and was now organized around their absence. The cities went first. The strikes were targeted at population centers and industrial facilities and military installations, which meant that the places where the greatest concentration of resources, expertise, and social infrastructure existed were the places that took the most direct damage. The survivors in the immediate aftermath of the war were disproportionately the people who had been outside the cities, rural populations, people who happened to be in areas not targeted, people who had been on the road when the bombs fell and had driven away from the blast zones rather than toward them. The vaults sealed, the doors closed, and the mechanical certainty of those closures was, for the people inside, simultaneously the greatest relief and the most profound loss they had ever experienced. The greatest relief because the door meant protection, meant survival, meant that the thing outside, which was audible even underground, that distant bass note of nuclear detonations that was felt more than heard, could not reach them. The most profound loss because the door also meant finality. The people left outside were gone. The world outside was gone. The life that had been built in the ordinary light of a pre-war morning was gone, and in its place was a vault, with its recycled air, and its flickering fluorescent lighting, and its 300 or 500 or 800 other people who were in the same position and would need to find a way to live together indefinitely in a space that had been designed for months rather than decades. The social dynamics of the first generation inside the vaults were the most genuinely novel thing about the post-war world, because they had no precedent that quite fit. The closest analogy was a submarine deployment or a polar research station. Small groups of people in enclosed environments, dependent on each other for survival, working within a hierarchy that the situation demanded. But submarines came back to port. Polar stations were staffed by rotations. The vaults, at least initially, had no return schedule. The overseers who ran them had institutional authority derived from Vault-Tec's structural design, but the emotional weight of that authority of managing people who had just lost everything they'd ever known was not something that institutional authority could fully address. The people who adapted best in the first generation, according to the holotapes and terminal entries that survive in the games as historical documents, were the people who had something useful to do. Doctors, engineers, agricultural technicians, teachers, people whose skills were immediately applicable to the vault's operational needs found purpose in the application of those skills, and purpose was the thing that most protected against the specific despair of people who had lost their context. The people who struggled most were the people whose pre-war identities depended on things that no longer existed. Lawyers, whose expertise required a legal system that had ceased to function. Sales representatives, whose skills required a market. Executives, whose authority required subordinates who believed in the legitimacy of the authority. The second generation, born in the vault and knowing nothing else, had a fundamentally different relationship to the outside world. For the first generation, the vault was a place of loss, a place that was not the home they had had, the substitute for a life that had been interrupted. For the second generation, the vault simply was the world. The outside was an abstraction, something the older people talked about with a quality in their voices that the children couldn't quite interpret. The third generation barely had that. The fourth generation didn't have it at all. This generational shift is important because it explains so much about what the vaults produce in the games. By the time the Vault Dweller emerges from Vault 13 in 2161, the vault has been sealed for 84 years, long enough that no one inside has any first-hand memory of the outside world. Long enough that the institutional culture of the vault has fully replaced the pre-war culture its founders brought in. Long enough that the outside world is genuinely alien to the person walking out into it. The Vault Dweller is not returning to a world they knew. They are entering a world they have only the most filtered and mediated relationship to. The outside world had not been idle for those 84 years. The humans who survived the initial war without Vault accessed the people who found basement shelters, who were outside the blast radii, who had been traveling when the bombs fell and had simply kept moving, had been doing the work of improvised survival in a landscape that was actively hostile, in ways that required constant adaptation. The radiation was the most obvious hostility, but it was not the only one. The changed wildlife was dangerous in ways that the pre-war world had offered no preparation for. The social breakdown that followed the collapse of institutional authority produced violence at scales that people who had lived in functioning societies couldn't immediately adapt to. The food supply was severely disrupted. The crops that had sustained the agricultural infrastructure of the pre-war world required soil conditions and water supplies that the nuclear exchange had compromised, and the animals that had formed the protein base of the American diet were either dead or mutated into things that required significant effort and risk to hunt. What the 84 years of post-war experience had produced, by the time the Vault Dweller walked out into it, was a wasteland ecology that was genuinely post-nuclear, not the nuclear winter of the immediate aftermath, but something that had stabilized around its new conditions. Communities had formed and sometimes died and sometimes survived. Trade routes had emerged along old road networks, because roads are where the terrain allows easiest movement, and that logic doesn't change because the world has ended. The hub was operating as a commercial center, because commerce, the exchange of things that people have for things that other people have, is one of the most fundamental forms of social cooperation and tends to re-emerge fairly quickly, even in disrupted environments, because the alternative is everyone trying to produce everything they need themselves, which is considerably harder. The ghouls of Necropolis had built their community above the ruins of Bakersfield, because the ruins of Bakersfield were what was there. The survivors of communities that had been caught in the blast zones, transformed by radiation into something that the pre-war world would have classified as monsters, had done what any group of survivors does: found each other, assessed their resources, built something livable from what was available. That the available materials included the irradiated streets and collapsed buildings of a former city was simply a fact about their specific situation, rather than a statement about their worth or their capacity. The super mutants that the Vault Dweller encounters were more recent products of the Mariposa FEV vats that had been running for decades under the Master's direction, not the first-generation survivors of the bombs themselves. Their organized presence in the wasteland by 2161 was something relatively new, less than 2 decades old, which is why the communities that the Vault Dweller moves through are still processing the threat rather than having adapted their defenses to it. What the post-war world had not done in 84 years was build any kind of institutional structure capable of coordinating across the distances that the pre-war world had organized. The hub's merchant companies were local. Shady Sands government was local. The Brotherhood of Steel, operating from Lost Hills, was the closest thing to an organization with regional capacity, and the Brotherhood's relationship to the communities around it was complicated by its hoarding instinct and its suspicion of outsiders. There was no NCR, yet Shady Sands was the seed that would become it. But in 2161, Shady Sands was a settlement of a few hundred people doing everything it could not to die. The absence of regional coordination meant that threats that were regional in scale, which the Master's super mutant army very much was, could not be addressed at the appropriate scale by any existing institution. The Brotherhood could have fielded significant force against Mariposa and the Cathedral. The reason they chose not to was a combination of their hoarding instinct. Mariposa was valuable as a technology source. Destroying it would lose that value, and their organizational risk aversion, sending significant forces into a conflict that wasn't immediately threatening the Brotherhood, meant exposing those forces to loss. The Vault Dweller, operating alone, was the solution to a problem that should have required an army, and the game's design is honest about this. In its way, by making the Vault Dweller's capacity to solve the problem dependent on finding the Master's specific vulnerability, rather than on simply being powerful enough to destroy everything. The first generation of the post-war world, looked at from the perspective of what came later, is a period of improvised survival, producing improvised institutions that would either die or grow into the more complex social structures of the mid-22 ND century. Most of them died. Some of them grew. The ones that grew were not necessarily the ones that deserved to grow. Survival advantage in the post-nuclear world was not perfectly correlated with virtue, but they were the ones that produced the NCR and the Brotherhood and the loose network of communities that the Chosen One would move through 80 years later. And that is, in the Fallout universe's implicit accounting, enough. Part 3. Continued. The Brotherhood's Long Road. The Brotherhood of Steel, that Roger Maxson founded at Lost Hills in the years after the Great War, went through several distinct phases in the decades and centuries that followed. And tracking those phases illuminates something important about how institutions change when they outlive their founders. The early Brotherhood Maxson's generation, and the generation immediately following, was organized around the specific experience of the founding: the discovery at Mariposa, the decision to desert, the exodus, the establishment at Lost Hills. This gave the organization a narrative of its own origin that was both motivating and limiting. The story of what happened at Mariposa, scientists using prisoners as unwilling test subjects for a biological weapon, was the Brotherhood's founding myth in the literal sense, the story that explained why the Brotherhood existed and what it was for. That story pointed in the direction of technological control, discipline, and institutional suspicion of anyone outside the Brotherhood's own hierarchy. These were reasonable lessons to draw from the specific experience. Whether they were the right lessons to organize an entire institution around for centuries was a different question. The scribes emerged as the Brotherhood's most distinctive element because they represented the specific synthesis of military structure with something closer to scholarly or monastic calling. Scribe chapters were responsible for acquiring, cataloging, maintaining, and transmitting technical knowledge, not just the Brotherhood's existing equipment, but anything of technological significance that its field operations encountered. The scribes were the institutional memory of the Brotherhood, and the quality of that memory was one of the things that kept the Brotherhood from collapsing under the weight of its own organizational complexity. Military organizations that do not develop good institutional memory tend to make the same mistakes repeatedly, and the Brotherhood's scribes were designed, from the beginning, to prevent that. The Knights, who were responsible for the Brotherhood's technological arsenal, the maintenance and deployment of the weapons and armor and equipment that made the Brotherhood so formidable, developed their own culture around the craft. Aspects of their work. Knighthood in the Brotherhood carried connotations that were genuinely craft-based. You were a knight because you had mastered the technical art of maintaining and deploying the Brotherhood's material capabilities. This was not purely an honorific. The Brotherhood's field effectiveness depended on the quality of its equipment, and the quality of its equipment depended on the quality of the people maintaining it. The Paladins formed the Brotherhood's frontline fighting force, and their culture was the one that most directly inherited the military traditions Maxon had brought from the pre-war army. Power armor operations, weapons deployment, tactical coordination, these were the Paladin domains, and the training that produced a Paladin was rigorous in ways that the pre-war military training Maxon had gone through would have been recognizable and compatible with, even if the specific enemies and equipment had changed considerably. The Elders, the Brotherhood's governing council, with a High Elder as the ultimate authority, were drawn from the most experienced members of all three main classes, and their decision-making was, in principle, collective. In practice, the degree to which Elder councils functioned collectively versus hierarchically tended to vary considerably with the specific personalities involved and the specific pressures the Brotherhood was facing at any given time. Strong leaders tended to produce more centralized decision-making, whether they intended to or not. Weaker or more consciously collaborative leaders tended to produce more genuinely deliberative processes, with all the advantages and inefficiencies that deliberation produces. The expeditions that the Brotherhood sent east over the decades after its founding represent the most complex chapter of its early history. The original Lost Hills chapter was a California institution, oriented around the California wasteland's specific challenges and opportunities. As the NCR grew and the political landscape of New California became more complicated, the Brotherhood's relationship to the surrounding world became more fraught. The NCR wanted access to Brotherhood technology. The Brotherhood wanted to maintain exclusive control of it. This was a conflict waiting to happen, and it did happen in the form of the NCR Brotherhood War that is referenced in Fallout New Vegas as a historical event, a conflict that went badly enough for the Brotherhood that it significantly reduced their presence in New California, pushed several chapters to relocate. The Capital Wasteland expedition under Owen Lyons was sent east in the mid-2200s, ostensibly to investigate technology rumors in the DC area and to establish a Brotherhood presence on the East Coast. What Lyons found there changed him in ways that the Lost Hills chapter would not approve of, and that he chose to follow anyway. The Capital Wasteland's super mutant population was actively threatening the civilian communities of the region, and the Lyons-led chapter was in a position to address it. Lyons made the decision to do so, redirecting his chapter's resources from pure technology acquisition towards something that looked considerably more like a military protection service for ordinary people. This decision was, from the perspective of the Lost Hills chapter's institutional values, a deviation. The Brotherhood's mandate was not to protect civilians. The Brotherhood's mandate was to preserve and control technology. The two goals were not compatible when preserving and controlling technology required the dedicated application of combat resources, and using those resources to protect civilians was not using them for their primary purpose. The outcasts who split from Lyons's chapter were not wrong about the institutional principle, they were just wrong about whether the institutional principle was the right organizing value for the specific situation the chapter was in. The East Coast Brotherhood's relationship with the Lone Wanderer in Fallout 3 is one of the clearest examples in the franchise of a faction that is neither simply heroic nor simply villainous. Lyons's chapter does genuine good in the Capital Wasteland. Its presence has protected communities that would otherwise have fallen to super mutant incursions. Sarah Lyons and her elite squad are capable soldiers who fight for something they genuinely believe in. And yet the Brotherhood is also an institution that arrived in the region with a mission of technology acquisition that maintained exclusive control over the most powerful weapons and armor in the region, and that was willing to deploy its capabilities in service of its own institutional goals, as much as in service of the communities it claimed to protect. Arthur Maxon's Brotherhood in Fallout 4 represents the institutional reaction against Lyons's reinterpretation. Maxon, raised in the Citadel, trained to be the last and greatest of the Maxon line, brought the East Coast Brotherhood back into alignment with the more militaristic version of the institutional mandate that the Lost Hills chapter would have approved of. His Brotherhood arrived in the Commonwealth on the Pridwen with a clear mission: destroy the Institute, and a clear ideological framework that classified synths as abominations and the Institute as an existential threat. The moral certainty that Maxon's Brotherhood exhibits is, in one light, admirable. Here is an institution that knows what it believes and acts accordingly. In another light, it is what institutions look like when they have stopped asking questions. The Brotherhood of Steel is, across its long history in the franchise, the most honest depiction of how military institutions evolve over time. It begins with a genuine moral foundation, Maxon's revulsion at Vault-Tec, and his commitment to preventing the repetition of that kind of unaccountable technological power. It develops institutional forms that serve that foundation, and then, over generations, those institutional forms gradually become the thing being served rather than the thing doing the serving. The mission becomes preservation of the Brotherhood, and the ideology becomes whatever justifies the actions the Brotherhood needs to take to preserve itself. Every major institutional character in Fallout undergoes this process. The NCR's democratic idealism produces a bureaucratic sprawl that is increasingly difficult to distinguish from the institutional inertia it was supposed to prevent. The Enclave's commitment to pure-blooded American civilization produces genocidal planning that betrays every value the civilization being preserved was supposed to embody. The Institute's scientific mission to rebuild humanity produces a project that treats humans as raw material. The Brotherhood is simply the most visible example of the process because it appears in every game. Part 4. Continued. The Vault Dwellers World. The California wasteland of 2161 was not a single environment. It was a collection of micro-environments, each with its own social dynamics, its own economy, its own relationship to the dangers of the post-nuclear landscape. Understanding this patchwork is important for understanding why the Vault Dwellers' journey was shaped the way it was, and why the choices they made had the effects they had. Shady Sands, the first settlement the Vault Dweller encounters, sits in a long valley between two mountain ridges. The valley provides some protection from the worst of the desert winds and from the kind of open-terrain raiding that made so many other communities vulnerable. The people who built it chose the location carefully. Someone in the founding group had enough knowledge of defensible terrain to recognize what the valley offered. They had also brought agricultural knowledge, which explains why Shady Sands was capable of growing crops in a wasteland where most communities were dependent on scavenging and hunting. The rad scorpion problem that the Vault Dweller helps with is real. The creatures are drawn to the settlement's water and food stores, but it is a manageable threat for a community with the social organization and agricultural stability that Shady Sands had achieved. The seeds of the NCR are visible in Shady Sands even in 2161. The community governance, the emphasis on agriculture and self-sufficiency, the willingness to engage with outsiders on principled terms rather than simply trying to take what they had. Aradesh, the settlement's leader, is not a warlord. He is an administrator, a man whose skills and values are oriented toward the maintenance and growth of a civil community rather than toward conquest or extraction. The NCR would eventually produce leaders of considerably less character, but its founding culture came from people like Aradesh, and that founding culture was enough to give the organization a trajectory that distinguished it from every other major post-nuclear faction. Junktown, the next major community the Vault Dweller can encounter, is a study in the tension between civic order and economic freedom that post-nuclear communities could never quite resolve. The town is run by a sheriff named Killian Darkwater, whose commitment to law and order is genuine but whose methods are limited by the resources and authority available to him in a community that has no formal legal system, no incarceration infrastructure, and no external enforcement mechanism. The opposing force is Gizmo, a crime boss whose influence runs through the town's economic life in ways that Killian can document but cannot directly challenge without evidence that Gizmo is too careful to provide. The Vault Dweller can tip the balance either way toward Killian's civic vision or toward Gizmo's criminal economy, and the game's design allows both outcomes without quite endorsing either as obviously correct. Gizmo incidentally gets around Junktown on a salvaged child's tricycle, being far too large to walk any distance. This detail is one of those moments of darkly absurdist comedy that the franchise had from its very beginning. The sense that the post-apocalyptic world is not simply grim, that it produces situations of genuine ridiculousness alongside its genuine horror, and that both can coexist in the same scene without either canceling the other out. The Hub is the largest community in the Southern California wasteland, and its commercial character shapes everything about how it functions. The water tower at the center of town is the literal foundation of the Hub's importance in a landscape where clean water is scarce. A reliable source of it is the thing that makes a trading center viable, because people who are moving goods through the wasteland need to drink and need to know they can get water without paying extortionate prices. The merchant families that control the Hub's economy have organized themselves into a loose structure that serves their collective interests while managing competition between them, and the caravans they send out across the wasteland are the economic bloodstream of the pre-NCR California wastelands. The Hub's caravans were also, before the Vault Dwellers' mission changed the situation, beginning to experience the super mutant threat in its commercial form. Disappearances of caravans, reports of attacks by something that wasn't raiders, the economic disruption of routes becoming unsafe. The merchants of the Hub didn't know about Mariposa or the Master or the Unity. They just knew that the roads were getting more dangerous and that their caravans were going missing, and that nobody could tell them why in a way that made sense. The children of the Cathedral, the Master's public face in the California wastelands, were present in the Hub as well, running a hospital under the guise of a religious organization providing medical services. This is one of the most quietly sinister details in the original Fallout. The idea that the organization responsible for the super mutant army was maintaining a visible, respectable public presence in the wasteland's most important commercial city, providing a service that communities desperately needed, using that service as a cover for intelligence gathering and for identifying the prime normal candidates they were looking for. The doctors at the Hub's Children of the Cathedral Clinic were doing genuine medical work. They were also filing reports on their patients that went to the Master's organization. Necropolis, the ghoul city built on the ruins of Bakersfield, is the place where the Vault Dweller finds the water chip, and also the place where the franchise first grapples seriously with the question of what ghouls are and what they represent in the post-nuclear world. The ghouls of Necropolis are not simply monsters. They are the survivors of Vault 12, people who were put into a vault that was deliberately designed to fail them, who were transformed by the radiation that the failed vault allowed in, and who built a community in the ruins of the city above their irradiating shelter because the ruins of Bakersfield were what they had. They are bitter, often hostile, and organized around a set of community norms that look, from the outside, strange and threatening. They are also, when the Vault Dweller takes the time to engage with them properly, people with histories and grievances and the kind of perspective on the post-nuclear world that only comes from having lived through the worst of it without any of the protection that the vaults, however terrible their experiments, at least provided. Seth, who can be encountered near the ghoul settlement, is a figure who communicates some of this depth, a ghoul with both the physical characteristics of his transformation and the evident intelligence and social sophistication of a person who has been navigating the wasteland's complexity for decades. The ghouls of Necropolis represent one of the first moments in the franchise where the monsters have enough characterization to stop being monsters and start being something more complicated. The Master's Cathedral in Los Angeles, the game's climactic location, nested in the ruins of a pre-war city that had been one of the largest urban concentrations in North America, is architecturally and thematically the opposite of Shady Sands. Where Shady Sands is growing, building, accumulating the social capital of a working community, the cathedral is a concentration of power organized around a single vision that has no room for challenge or modification. The children of the cathedral who occupy the above-ground cathedral building are devoted to the Master in the way that followers of charismatic leaders tend to be devoted, completely, with a complete absence of the critical distance that would allow them to assess whether what they were devoted to made sense. The Master himself, when the Vault Dweller finally encounters him in the vaults below the cathedral, is one of the most genuinely unsettling presences in the franchise's history. The voice work in the original Fallout conveys the quality of his intelligence vast, strange, multiple in the way that something evolved beyond individual human consciousness tends to be multiple, while also making clear the specific kind of wrongness that his transformation has produced. He is not evil in the way that a person who has chosen evil is evil. He is a mind that has lost the capacity for certain kinds of empathy, while retaining other capacities at extraordinary scale. He cares about humanity's survival. He is doing something to humanity that most humans would experience as worse than extinction. These two things are not, for the Master, contradictory. The conversation that can end the Master's plan without violence is one of the most structurally interesting sequences in the franchise's history, because it requires the player to engage with the Master's logic rather than simply defeat his forces. You cannot persuade him on emotional grounds. His emotional architecture has been so profoundly altered that emotional arguments bounce off. You can only persuade him on logical grounds, by presenting evidence that his plan is internally self-defeating. The FEV renders its subjects sterile, and a civilization built on sterile supermutants is not a civilization, it's a generation, and then nothing. The Master, presented with this evidence, applies his vast intelligence to it, concludes that it's correct, and ends himself. It is, in its own way, a portrait of a kind of integrity that the game seems to respect even as it concludes that the Master had to be stopped. Part 5. Continued. The Enclave's True Face. The Enclave of Fallout 2 is the most complete and most terrifying version of the organization that would appear in modified forms in Fallout 3 and would be hinted at in the television series. Understanding what the Enclave was, structurally and ideologically, is essential for understanding why it keeps returning in the franchise's history and what it represents in the larger argument about power and legitimacy that runs through the entire series. The Enclave was not simply a group of bad people who decided to do bad things. It was an institution, one of the most sophisticated and well-resourced institutions in the post-war world, and its badness was institutional rather than personal. The individuals within the Enclave were, for the most part, people who believed sincerely in what they were doing. They believed that they were the legitimate government of the United States, operating in continuity from the pre-war administration despite the disruption of the Great War. They believed that the people living in the wasteland were, by definition, genetically compromised by radiation exposure and therefore could not be trusted with the future of human civilization. They believed that the Enclave's role was to preserve the pure remnant of humanity themselves and their carefully screened associates, and to eventually reclaim the surface from the mutations that the bombs had produced. This belief system was coherent in the way that belief systems developed by isolated institutions with no external accountability tend to become coherent, internally consistent, self-reinforcing, increasingly disconnected from any test against reality. The Enclave had not had significant interaction with the wasteland surface population in decades by the time of Fallout 2. Their knowledge of who lived out there and what those people were like came primarily from intelligence reports and the findings of the Vault experimental program documents that described populations as data points rather than as communities of persons. This abstraction, combined with the ideological framework that preemptively categorized the wasteland population as genetically impure, made it very easy for the Enclave's planners to discuss the elimination of that population in the measured tones of operational planning, rather than the appalled tones of confronting mass murder. President Dick Richardson is the most visible face of this ideology in Fallout 2, and he is deeply uncomfortable as a character because he is not a monster in his own mind or in his bearing. He is a statesman, a man of conviction and competence, the leader of an organization that he believes has the responsibility to make hard decisions for the benefit of humanity. His hard decision happens to be the extermination of approximately 200 million people who are, from his perspective, no longer meaningfully human. He discusses this decision with the calm precision of someone who has thought about it carefully and concluded that the math works out. The horror of the encounter is that he is not ranting or cackling or exhibiting any of the behavioral markers that would allow the Chosen One or the player to categorize him as simply deranged. He is reasonable. He is organized. He is completely, utterly wrong, in ways that his institutional framework has made it impossible for him to perceive. Frank Horrigan represents the Enclave's experimental extreme, a man who had been serving as an Enclave intelligence agent who was exposed to FEV under circumstances that the Enclave's records are not entirely clear about, and who underwent a transformation that, rather than rendering him sterile like the standard FEV application, instead produced something that the Enclave scientists decided to lean into rather than remediate. Horrigan is enormous and fast and almost impossible to damage with conventional weapons and the power armor he wears has been integrated into his body to the point where the distinction between the armor and the man is no longer entirely meaningful. He serves the Enclave not because he has been persuaded of its ideology, but because the Enclave's structure is the only framework in which his existence makes sense. He is the Enclave's most powerful tool and, in a literal physical sense, its most obvious expression of what happens when the organization's tendency to treat people as material reaches its logical endpoint. The Chosen One's destruction of the Poseidon Energy oil rig was not simply the defeat of the Enclave as an organization. It was the exposure of the Enclave's core claim that it was the legitimate government of the United States, operating in continuity, preserving what was worth preserving as the particular kind of self-serving fiction that powerful institutions construct to justify their continued existence. The United States that the Enclave claimed to represent had been dead for 165 years. Its laws had not been enforced, its institutions had not functioned, its population had not been served. What had continued was a group of people with access to that government's surviving resources, claiming the authority of an institution they had done nothing to earn or maintain, and using that claimed authority to justify doing whatever served their survival and their plans. The Enclave's defeat in California did not destroy the organization, it scattered it. And scattered institutions, as the franchise consistently demonstrates, have a way of reconstituting themselves around whatever resources and ideological commitments survive the scattering. Part 6. Continued. The Capital Wasteland's deeper history. The Capital Wasteland, that the lone wanderer moves through in 2277, had been shaped by 200 years of post-war history that the game conveys in fragments through terminal entries, through conversations with older residents, through the physical state of the ruins the player moves through. Understanding that history enriches everything that happens in the main storyline. The super mutants that had established themselves in the ruins of Washington, D.C., were not the product of the same FEV pipeline that produced the Master's Army in California. The Institute, operating underground in what had been the MIT campus in Cambridge, had been conducting its own research into synthetic life and biological modification, and at some point in the 22nd century had produced an FEV mutation that, when released into the DC area's surface population, produced the super mutants the lone wanderer encounters. The Institute's creation of the DC super mutants was not, apparently, entirely intentional. The records are incomplete, but the result was a super mutant population that was concentrated in a major urban area, with abundant pre-war buildings to use as fortifications and a steady supply of unaltered humans to capture and forcibly convert. The Brotherhood's arrival in the Capital Wasteland under Lyons had been responding to exactly this situation. The technology investigation mission was genuine, the DC area had been the center of a great deal of pre-war military and government research, and the ruins held things that the Lost Hills chapter wanted. But the scale of the super mutant threat was something that Lyons had not fully anticipated, and his response to it, deciding that fighting the super mutants was more important than the pure technology mission, was a decision made in the field, without Lost Hills' approval, with consequences that continued to play out for decades. The Enclave's presence in the Capital Wasteland in 2277 was the result of the same pattern that had brought them east of California after their oil rig defeat. The organization had surviving members in various locations, had been slowly reconsolidating for decades, and had identified the DC area as the location where the most valuable pre-war government infrastructure still existed in accessible form. Raven Rock, the Enclave's primary base in the Capital Wasteland, was a pre-war military installation that had survived the bombs well enough to be converted into a headquarters for whatever remained of the Enclave's East Coast operations. John Henry Eden, whose nature as an AI is one of Fallout 3's better surprises, had been running Raven Rock's system since approximately 2242, long enough to have developed something that functioned like institutional memory and personal conviction, even if the consciousness it was housed in was constructed rather than born. Project Purity's history before Fallout 3 is worth dwelling on because it explains why James's return to the Jefferson Memorial mattered so much to so many people. The project had been conceived and begun by James and Catherine in the 2250s, as a response to the observation that the Capital Wasteland's most persistent obstacle to human recovery was not super mutants or raiders but the irradiation of the water supply. Clean water, in the capital wasteland, was expensive to produce, limited in quantity, and controlled by whoever happened to control the production. This gave enormous economic power to a very small number of entities, including the water merchants of Rivet City, and kept the majority of the wasteland's population in a state of chronic scarcity that made everything else harder. The Project Purity concept was simple. Use the Jefferson Memorial's existing water management infrastructure as the basis for a large-scale purification system. Draw water from the tidal basin and the Potomac, purify it using a combination of filtration and what James and Catherine's research eventually called a modified Geck resonance system, and distribute the purified output across the capital wasteland. If it worked, it would break the water monopoly and produce a surplus that could support population growth, agricultural expansion, and the kind of economic development that clean water makes possible. The research was difficult and required resources that the small team of scientists couldn't always access. Catherine's death and James's withdrawal to Vault 101 had stopped work on the project in 2258 at a critical stage. The scientists who remained in Rivet City, led by Dr. Madison Lee, had continued theoretical work but couldn't complete the practical implementation without James. The project sat, incomplete, for 19 years, while the wasteland continued to die of thirst around it. James's return was driven partly by the discovery of the Geck in Vault 112, the final technical piece he needed, and partly by something that the game represents as a kind of conscience finally too loud to continue. Ignoring. He had been safe in Vault 101. The Lone Wanderer had been safe in Vault 101. But safety purchased by staying inside while the world outside needed what only he could provide was a form of cowardice that James, by 2277, could not continue to accommodate. The Liberty Prime sequence at the end of Fallout 3 deserves its reputation as one of the more memorable set pieces in the franchise's history because it earns its spectacle. The preceding hours of the game have established both the scale of the Enclave's power and the Brotherhood's limitations in confronting it. Liberty Prime's activation represents the resolution of a problem that genuinely needed that level of force. The robot's anti-communist sloganeering, "Democracy is non-negotiable," tactical nuclear warhead armed, communism is the very definition of failure, operates as satire. That is also completely sincere, because Liberty Prime was programmed by people who sincerely believed these things, and that sincerity has persisted through 200 years of dormancy, unadulterated by the irony of its context. The water that flows from Project Purity at the end of Fallout 3 is real. The Broken Steel DLC confirms that the purification system stays operational and that the Brotherhood makes genuine efforts to distribute the water across the capital wasteland. This is one of the franchise's rare, unambiguous improvements in the state of the world, and it matters precisely because the franchise so rarely offers them. Part 7. Continued. The Mojave Factions in Depth. The Mojave Wasteland of 2281 is more politically complex than any previous Fallout setting, and understanding that complexity requires looking at each major faction, not just in terms of what they do, but why they believe what they believe. The New California Republic's presence in the Mojave is the result of a decades-long process of expansion that was driven by economic logic as much as political ideology. The NCR needed resources specifically. It needed the power that Hoover Dam could provide and the trade routes that control of the Mojave would open. But the NCR also genuinely believed in the values it stated: democracy, rule of law, individual rights, the protection of citizens from the violence that the wasteland produced when no institution existed to prevent it. The tension within the NCR, which runs through every conversation the Courier has with its representatives, is between these genuinely held values and the practical constraints of being an expanding state that is moving faster than its institutional capacity can keep up with. The NCR in the Mojave is stretched thin. Its supply lines are long, its soldiers are tired, its officers are dealing with problems that range from the strategic, the Legion at the dam, to the absurd, the Great Khan selling drugs to NCR soldiers, the fiends raiding NCR supply convoys. The bureaucracy back in California is making decisions about the Mojave based on incomplete information delivered through slow communication channels. The soldiers on the ground know things that the bureaucracy doesn't, and the bureaucracy is making decisions that the soldiers have to live with. This is the administrative dysfunction that all large organizations face when their reach exceeds their administrative capacity, and the NCR is experiencing it at scale. General Lee Oliver, commanding the NCR forces in the Mojave, is a man of competence and conventional thinking in a situation that requires unconventional responses. He knows how to fight the Legion in open battle. His defensive positions at Hoover Dam and his deployment of the NCR Rangers are both professionally executed. What he can't do is find the political and tactical flexibility to take advantage of the courier's capabilities or the various non-standard alliances available in the Mojave. He wants to fight the Battle of Hoover Dam his way, and his way is good enough to win if nothing goes wrong. But the Mojave is full of things going wrong. Caesar's Legion presents the most challenging ideological object in the franchise because it is not simply a band of violent people. It is a thought-through political project, built by someone who had genuinely studied how societies are organized and had made specific decisions about what worked and what didn't. Caesar Edward Sallow had read the Fallout universe's equivalents of Gibbon and Tacitus and other historians of Rome, and had used those readings to construct a theory of what went wrong with pre-war civilization and what a working alternative would look like. His diagnosis: pre-war civilization failed because it was decadent, individualistic, and unable to organize sufficient collective discipline to address collective problems. The resource wars were the consequence of a civilization that had prioritized individual consumption over collective sustainability. The Great War was the consequence of nations that could not coordinate their competing interests, even when the alternative was mutual annihilation. What the post-war world needed was not more of the same, not more democracies that would produce the same decadence, not more economic systems that would produce the same resource wars, but a genuinely different organizing principle. Caesar's organizing principle was discipline, the subordination of individual interest to collective purpose, enforced if necessary by the kind of violence that makes the cost of defection from the collective clear enough that defection stops being the rational choice. He built the Legion on this principle, and the Legion worked, in the narrow sense that it produced a military force of extraordinary effectiveness, and that the communities under Legion control were genuinely more peaceful than the equivalent communities under no control at all. The women enslaved by the Legion, the people crucified for infractions, the complete absence of anything like individual rights, these were not bugs in Caesar's system. They were features, expressions of the principle that individual rights were the thing that had destroyed the old civilization and that a working new one could not afford them. What Caesar didn't account for, and what the franchise consistently points toward as a fundamental limitation of his project, was the dependency of the Legion's structure on his own continued existence. The Legion was not a system that could reproduce itself without the person who had built it. Its discipline came from Caesar, its ideology came from Caesar, its decisions about succession and expansion and policy came from Caesar. Without Caesar, the Legion was a very effective military force. Without a political infrastructure, and political infrastructure, it turns out, is what distinguishes a civilization from an army. Robert House is the most intellectually honest of the major Mojave factions, in the sense that he does not pretend to represent values he doesn't hold. He is not claiming to be a democracy or a republic or any other political form that carries aspirational connotations. He is a very intelligent individual who has survived through technological sophistication and careful planning, who has a vision for the future of human civilization that he believes is correct, and who wants to implement that vision with the minimum possible interference from institutions that he believes have already demonstrated their inadequacy. The NCR demonstrated it by being the kind of bureaucratic democracy that produces the problems it was supposed to solve. The Legion demonstrated it by building something effective and brittle in equal measure. Mr. House represents the third option: competent autocracy in service of a genuine long-term plan. Whether you trust this option depends on whether you trust Robert House. The game is honest about the fact that trusting Robert House requires extending trust to a single individual in a way that removes all external accountability and check on what that individual decides to do. House is probably correct that his plan would work. House is also over 250 years old and has spent most of that time alone in a life support pod, which is an unusual basis for the kind of human judgment that good leadership requires. And House's plan, if it works, produces a civilization designed around his values and assumptions without any mechanism by which the people in it could express disagreement with those values and assumptions. The independent New Vegas option siding with Yes Man, using the upgraded Securitrons to establish New Vegas as an independent polity free of any faction's control, is the most ideologically libertarian of the endings, and the most honest about the costs of that ideology. You get freedom from House's autocracy, and from the NCR's bureaucracy, and from the Legion's totalitarianism. What you don't get is a plan, or an institution, or anything other than a beginning. What happens after the Battle of Hoover Dam in an independent New Vegas depends on what the Courier does next and on whether the various communities of the Mojave can develop the kind of institutional capacity that would allow them to manage their own affairs without either the structure House provides or the coercion the Legion provides or the administration the NCR provides. The franchise doesn't tell you. The game ends. The wasteland continues. What happens next is what always happens next. People trying to build something from what they have, with results that depend on the specific combination of individuals and circumstances that the moment produces. Part 8, continued. Appalachia's survivors. The specific character of Appalachian survival in the years between 2077 and 2102 is documented in the Fallout 76 game world in more detail than any other comparable period in the franchise's history, and that documentation reveals something important about how communities form and fail at the margins of disaster. The responders, who built their post-war organization from the first responders who survived the Great War, represent the most systematic attempt at community service in the post-war East. Their camps at Flatwoods, their supply routes, their cooking and medical guides posted in locations throughout Appalachia, all of this was designed explicitly for the people who would come after them. The responders knew, fairly early in their existence, that the scorched plague was something they could not defeat. Their response to this knowledge was not despair but documentation. If we can't survive, at least we can leave instructions for whoever can. The medical guides the responders created are extraordinary documents in the context of the post-war world. They are practical, detailed, organized, and written in language accessible to someone without formal medical training. They deal with wound care, radiation treatment, dehydration, and the specific medical challenges posed by the wasteland's changed biology. They were designed to be usable by people who might never have had any medical training at all, because the responders understood that medical knowledge, once lost, produces suffering at a scale that was preventable if the knowledge could be preserved and transmitted. Every holotape found in a responder cache is an act of generosity toward an unknown future reader. The Free State's approach was fundamentally different and in many ways a mirror image of the responders' communalism. The Free States had prepared for the war independently, had built shelters and caches and communities that were, by design, self-sufficient and disconnected from larger institutional structures. Their ideology was libertarian in a genuine sense. They believed in individual and small community self-determination. They were suspicious of large organizations which had, in their view, both produced the war and failed to prevent it, and they had organized their post-war survival around the assumption that whatever institutions emerged from the war would probably be bad for the people in them. This made them better prepared in some ways. They had supplies, weapons, and skills that the responders' more service-oriented model didn't produce, and worse prepared in other ways, particularly the social ways. Communities organized around autonomy and self-sufficiency have a hard time calling for help when they need it, because calling for help is exactly the thing their ideology says you shouldn't need to do. When the scorched plague advanced into Free States territory, the response was individual fortification rather than collective defense, which was exactly the wrong response to a threat that spread through proximity. The Enclave's Appalachian presence had its own distinctive quality, shaped by the specific historical moment. This was a version of the organization that predated the California chapter's defeat, more confident, more ideologically coherent in the specific way that organizations are coherent before they've faced a genuine external challenge. The Appalachian Enclave was building toward the kind of decisive action that the California chapter's destruction of the Poseidon oil rig would eventually prevent, and its interest in the Appalachian ICBM arsenal was genuinely alarming. A nuclear arsenal in Enclave hands, in 2102, would have given the organization leverage that it had lacked in the California conflict. The Brotherhood of Steel's Appalachian chapter, under Paladin Taggarty, was a remarkable institution, small and disciplined, and shaped by the specific combination of Maxon's founding vision, transmitted to Taggarty through their friendship before the war, and the specific demands of the Appalachian situation. Taggarty had maintained communication with Maxon via radio in the years after the war, and those communications form one of the most affecting pieces of Fallout 76's audio lore. Two old friends, separated by the continent, trying to maintain a relationship across the silence of a post-war radio network while each of them builds something that will hopefully outlast them. The communications break down eventually, the radio contact becomes less frequent, then stops, and the Appalachian Brotherhood is left to develop without the input of the Lost Hills chapter. This isolation shapes the chapter's evolution. It becomes more locally focused, more community-oriented in the Lions mode, because the specific demands of the Appalachian situation required community engagement that pure technology hoarding couldn't provide. Taggarty's chapter was fighting the Scorched while trying to help the responders and manage the Enclave threat and maintain its own institutional coherence, and that was too many things for the resources available. The final transmissions of the Appalachian Brotherhood are historical documents of an institution that ran out of road. Not because of failure in any particular engagement, but because the cumulative weight of fighting a biological threat that could not be defeated by conventional military action, with resources that were finite and replacements that were not coming from California, eventually exceeded the chapter's capacity to continue. The last entries in the Fort Atlas terminals are matter-of-fact about this. The numbers are diminishing, the resupply is not coming, the Scorched advance is continuing, the chapter will not survive. The documentation of what they knew and what they built should survive, if possible, so that whoever comes later has a starting point. They were right to prioritize the documentation. The Vault dwellers who emerged in 2102 found that starting point and built from it. The Wastelanders' expansion to Fallout 76 is set far enough after the base game's events that the Scorchbeast Queen has been defeated, and Appalachia is beginning to draw settlers, people coming from other parts of the East Coast, attracted by the relative safety of a region that has had its apex predators cleared out. The settlers who arrive with good intentions and the raiders who arrive with their own logic of survival establish the social dynamics that the Vault dwellers are now navigating alongside their own community-building efforts. The Atlantic City expeditions and later content push the Fallout 76 timeline to 2105, by which point Appalachia is becoming genuinely inhabited in a way it wasn't in 2102. The Brotherhood of Steel's new chapter at Fort Atlas is established and building capacity. The wider world, the NCR to the west, the remnants of the East Coast factions to the south is present as context, not yet as direct story, but the implication is that Appalachia is being drawn back into a wider world that will make its specific isolation increasingly difficult to maintain. Part 9. Continued. The Commonwealth's Human Texture. The Commonwealth of 2287 is a world of remarkable density. Within a relatively small geographic area, Greater Boston and its surrounding counties, an extraordinary number of distinct communities, factions, individuals, and institutional remnants are packed into a landscape that manages to feel both vast and intimate at the same time. Understanding why requires looking at the specific history of the Boston area in the 2 centuries between the bombs and the sole survivor's emergence from Vault 111. The Institute had been operating beneath the MIT campus since roughly the 2110s, the survivors of the Technical University's pre-war research community, finding the underground facilities they'd built for various pre-war projects suddenly very relevant to the need to survive and continue working without surface exposure. The first generation of Institute inhabitants were people who remembered the pre-war world and who organized their post-war existence around the continuation of that world's research priorities. The second generation were people raised in the Institute who knew the surface world only through the Institute's filtered presentation of it. By 2287, the current generation of Institute inhabitants has essentially no meaningful connection to the surface world except as a resource to be monitored, managed, and occasionally interfered with. The Institute's relationship to the surface has gone through several phases. There was an early period of relatively open engagement, the Institute trading technology and knowledge with surface communities, positioning itself as the successor institution to MIT's public service tradition. This period ended badly. The surface communities wanted things the Institute wasn't willing to provide, asked questions the Institute wasn't willing to answer, and pushed against the boundaries of the relationship in ways that the Institute found threatening. The Institute retreated. The relationship became one of surveillance and occasional intervention, with the Institute maintaining a watching brief over the surface communities without any genuine accountability for what that watching produced. The synth replacement program, in which Institute coursers would take surface people, bring them underground for examination, create a synthetic copy to replace them in their community, and then either integrate the original into Institute society or, more often, terminate them, was the expression of this phase. The Institute needed information about surface communities that it couldn't get through simple surveillance. Replacement gave it embedded intelligence assets, people who lived as surface dwellers, and could provide the Institute with ongoing data about what those communities were doing and thinking. The disruption this caused to the surface communities, the wife was replaced by a synth stories that run through Diamond City's culture, was registered as a cost, but a cost that the Institute's leadership had decided was acceptable. Diamond City's specific history illuminates the Commonwealth's more general political development. The settlement inside Fenway Park began as a collection of survivors who had recognized that the stadium's walls provided exactly the kind of defensible perimeter that post-nuclear community building requires. The early Diamond City was functional but rough, a place where the most physically powerful individuals set the terms, where access was controlled by whoever had the weapons to control it. Over generations, something approaching civil society had developed. Elections for mayor, something like a law enforcement capacity, the economic specialization that produces merchants and mechanics and doctors, rather than requiring everyone to provide everything for themselves. Mayor McDonough, who is in power when the sole survivor arrives in 2287, is one of the game's more disturbing revelations. He has been using his position to expel ghouls from Diamond City, framing the expulsion as a safety measure, while actually implementing a policy of discrimination against a group whose only relevant characteristic is their appearance. He is, as the game eventually reveals, himself a synth, which makes his anti-ghoul policy a particularly dark form of passing. The performance of prejudice against one marginalized group by a member of another marginalized group who has the institutional power to pretend to belong to the dominant culture. The Good Neighbor settlement, across the river in what had been downtown Boston, represents the alternative to Diamond City's uneasy civic order. A community organized around the principle that everyone is welcome as long as they respect the community's basic norms of non-interference with others. Good Neighbor is run by Hancock, a ghoul who became mayor through a process involving the forcible removal of his predecessor. It is a community where the tolerance is genuine, but the safety is lower than Diamond City's, where the diversity of its inhabitants produces friction alongside its richness. The Memory Den, a business in Good Neighbor that allows paying customers to experience recorded memories, including their own pre-war ones, is perhaps the franchise's most pointed commentary on nostalgia. A service built on the premise that people will pay to experience what they've lost, that the past is a commodity in a world that has very few luxuries available. The railroad's operations in the Commonwealth are an exercise in constraint. An organization doing something genuinely important, helping synths escape from institutional control that treats them as property with very limited resources, in a context where it is hunted by two of the region's most powerful factions. The railroad's internal culture reflects this constraint. Everyone has a code name, operational security is paramount, trust is given slowly and based on demonstrated reliability rather than stated values. Desdemona, the railroad's leader, is a woman who has built an effective underground organization under conditions that should have made it impossible, and whose leadership is characterized by exactly the combination of pragmatism and conviction that an underground organization requires. The Brotherhood's arrival in the Commonwealth in 2287 is, for the sole survivor, a reference point that the rest of the franchise has established clearly enough that the Pridwin's appearance is recognizable even to someone who has just woken up from 210 years of sleep. Arthur Maxon's Brotherhood is the most militarized version of the organization the games have shown, organized around a clear enemy, the Institute. A clear mission: destroy the synths, acquire the technology, clear the Commonwealth, and a clear hierarchy that produces decisions quickly, even if not always wisely. Its presence is genuinely useful in the sense that Liberty Prime is genuinely useful. It brings force that the other factions can't match. Its presence is genuinely problematic in the sense that it brings values that the other factions can't accept. The classification of all synths as threats to be eliminated regardless of their individual histories or the question of whether they are persons. The sole survivor's position in all of this is structurally unique in the franchise. They are not a product of the post-war world. They are a person who lived in the pre-war world, who remembers it not as a myth or a historical record, but as the life they were living 2 days ago, subjectively. This gives them a relationship to the institutions of the Commonwealth that no other major character shares. They can compare what exists with what was, and the comparison is personal rather than abstract. What they find, when they make that comparison, is both that things are much worse than they were, and that things are also much better than the worst-case scenario. The pre-war world produced the bombs. The post-war world produced communities of people who have lived through the worst thing that ever happened to humanity and are still, most of them, trying to build something decent from it. The sole survivor, who watched their spouse killed and their child taken, and who woke up to a world that had moved on entirely without them, is in a position to understand both the loss and the continuation more completely than anyone else in the Commonwealth. And what they do with that position, which faction they support, what choices they make at the points where choices matter determines, in the game's logic, what the Commonwealth becomes next. Part 10. Continued. The television series and what comes next. The Fallout television series occupies a specific position in the franchise's history that no previous entry did. It is both a piece of the canonical story and a meta-commentary on the franchise's own mythology. The choices that executive producers Jonathan Nolan and Lisa Joy made about what to adapt, what to invent, and how to position the show relative to the games reflect not just creative decisions but interpretive ones. Choices about what the Fallout franchise means, and what aspects of that meaning are most worth bringing to a new medium, and a new audience. The decision to set the show in the Los Angeles area rather than the Boston or Washington, D.C., settings of the most recent games was in part practical. The show is produced in California and in part thematic. Los Angeles is, in the pre-war American mythology, the capital of the dream, the city where you go to become the version of yourself that you want to be, the city whose industry is literally the production and distribution of aspirational images of what life could look like. Setting the post-war story in the ruins of that city is a statement about the relationship between aspiration and reality that the franchise had always been interested in, but had never approached quite so directly. The 3-vault cluster of vaults 31, 32, and 33 was invented specifically for the show and serves as one of its most effective pieces of world-building because it extends Vault-Tec's corruption in a new direction. The game vaults are mostly experiments in human psychology and sociology, designed to produce data for the Enclave's post-war planning. The 3-vault system is something different. It's a corporate succession program, designed not to produce data, but to produce management talent for the post-war era. Bud Askins's Buds was a pre-war management training program being run in the post-war period, using the vault's population as the pool from which corporate-approved leaders would emerge. This is the most direct expression in any Fallout media of the show's central argument, that the Great War was not an accident, not a tragic miscalculation, not the logical consequence of competition that exceeded human control, but a planned event planned by the people who had already arranged their own survival and who wanted the post-war world to be theirs. The evidence the show accumulates for this argument is not definitive, and the show is careful not to make it definitive, because the franchise's tradition of ambiguity about the war's causes is worth preserving. But the weight of the evidence points in the direction of Vault-Tec's corporate leadership having known the bombs were coming and having arranged for those bombs to fall on a schedule that served their plans. This is darker than anything the games had directly implied. The games always left open the possibility that the Great War was tragic in the classic sense, the consequence of human failure rather than human planning. The show suggests that the failure might have been more intentional than tragic. This is not a comfortable suggestion, and the show is right to approach it carefully, because the difference between the world ended because humans are bad at managing competition and the world ended because specific humans decided it should has profound implications for how you think about accountability, about the relationship between survivors and the civilization they're building, about whether the wasteland is a warning or a crime scene. Cooper Howard's arc across both seasons is the show's deepest investigation of this question. He was there before the war, and he was beginning to understand what was happening. He did not understand it completely or in time to do anything about it. And he has been living with that specific form of guilt, the guilt of someone who was adjacent to the worst thing that ever happened, who might have been in a position to prevent it if they had understood sooner for 219 years. The ghoul is what happens to guilt when it outlives the person who feels it and keeps going anyway. Lucy McClane's journey across both seasons is the franchise's most self-aware examination of what it produces as a narrative form. Every Fallout protagonist is sent out of a vault into a wasteland and forced to learn that the world outside is not the world they were prepared for. The franchise has always been clear about this. What the show adds is a degree of metacritical awareness about what that learning means. Lucy doesn't just learn that the wasteland is hard. She learns that the vault, which she had assumed was simply a refuge, was a system designed by the same people who built the wasteland. She learns that the clean divide between the protected and the unprotected, the lucky and the unlucky, was a divide produced by specific choices made by specific people, and not by the natural operation of catastrophe. This is perhaps the show's most significant contribution to the Fallout mythology, the argument that the vaults were not innocent. We knew they were experimental. The show pushes further into the possibility that the experiments were not the primary purpose of the vaults, that the primary purpose was something stranger and more corporate and more specific to the specific human beings who built them. The vaults were buds, at scale. They were management succession programs for the post-war corporate order that Vault-Tec's leadership intended to build. Season 2's movement to New Vegas opens the franchise's most beloved setting to a television audience, and the implications of that opening are still being worked through. The Mojave of 2296 is a place that has had 15 years to absorb the consequences of whatever happened at the Second Battle of Hoover Dam, and those consequences are visible in the physical and social landscape in ways that the show is beginning to document. The NCR's remnants in the region are a specific kind of institution in decay, people who still carry the values and the terminology of the Republic, trying to figure out what those values mean now that the institutional structure that gave them coherence is gone. The Legion's survivors are a different kind of decay, the military culture without the charismatic leadership that gave it direction, fragmenting in the ways that military cultures without clear purpose tend to fragment. New Vegas itself, in the show's version of 2296, is neither the gleaming monument of House's management nor the destroyed ruin that any decisive victory would have produced. It is a city in negotiation with its own history, still using the casino architecture, still organized around the Strip's original geography, but having developed through 15 years of whatever political arrangement the second battle produced into something that isn't quite any of the 4 endings that the game made available. This is as it should be. The show is telling its own story within the franchise's world, and the story it's telling doesn't require the game's ending to be canon in any specific form. It requires the Mojave to be interesting in 2296, and the Mojave is very interesting in 2296. What the franchise as a whole, across all its entries and both seasons of television, is ultimately producing is an argument about time, about what it means to inherit a world, about the relationship between the choices made in the past and the conditions of the present, about whether the past is escapable or whether it simply accumulates, layer by layer, under everything that comes after it, shaping the present in ways that are invisible until they aren't. The bombs fell in 2077 because decisions made decades earlier had produced a system in which the bombs were the logical outcome. The vaults were designed in 2050, something because decisions made by Vault-Tec's leadership had produced an institution in which the experiments were the logical outcome. The NCR's bureaucratic failure in 2281 was the logical outcome of decisions made by NCR leadership in the 2240s about how fast to expand. The Institute's disconnection from surface humanity was the logical outcome of decisions made by the first generation of Institute inhabitants about how to manage the boundary between their underground community and the surface world. Every present in the Fallout universe is the consequence of a past that people tried to escape and couldn't quite. Every future is being shaped by choices being made right now that will look, in 200 years, like they were inevitable. The vault dwellers who emerge from their vaults are not escaping this logic. They are entering it, becoming part of it, adding their choices to the accumulation. What the franchise keeps, through all of this, what makes it endurable, and even occasionally beautiful, rather than simply devastating, is its consistent commitment to the idea that the individuals within the system still matter. that the Vault Dweller building Arroyo mattered, that the Lone Wanderer activating Project Purity mattered, that the Courier, whatever choice they made at Hoover Dam, mattered to the people who lived with the consequences of that choice. That Lucy McLean stumbling through the Los Angeles wasteland with her optimism mostly intact, despite everything the wasteland has done to it matters, because the optimism is the thing that makes the building possible, and without the building there is only the rubble. The wasteland needs the people who keep trying. It has always needed them. It always will. If you made it all the way to the end of this journey, from the chrome-plated optimism of a world that never left the 1950s, through the 2 hours that ended it, through 84 years of vault isolation and 200 years of survival and reconstruction and war, through every protagonist who stepped through a vault door into something they weren't prepared for, thank you. This has been one of the longest trips through the Fallout universe ever attempted, and you took it with me. Leave a comment with your favorite Fallout game, your favorite character, or just the coordinates of wherever in the world you finally drifted off. And if this kind of deep, slow, immersive storytelling is what you come here for, subscribe. The wasteland is large. There is so much more to explore. Sleep well. War never changes, but you get to rest. Bonus. The mythology of the wasteland, what Fallout is really about. Every great franchise has a core mythology, a set of ideas and images and questions that persist across every iteration and give the whole thing coherence. Star Wars is about fathers and sons and the seduction of power. Star Trek is about the capacity of reason to solve problems that seem to require violence. The Lord of the Rings is about the corruption of power and the virtue of the small and humble. Fallout's mythology is about inheritance, specifically about what it means to inherit a world that the previous generation destroyed, and whether the people doing the inheriting can do anything differently than the people who came before them. This question runs through every game and now through the television series, but it takes a different form in each iteration because each protagonist inherits a different specific world. The Vault Dweller inherits the particular ruin of 2161 California, shaped by 84 years of post-war survival. The Chosen One inherits the slightly more organized ruin of 2241, where some communities have grown and others have failed, and the NCR is beginning to look like something real. The Lone Wanderer inherits the capital wasteland, shaped by both the bombs and by 200 years of institutional failure and occasional success. The Courier inherits the Mojave at a moment of maximum tension, when everything that's been building since 2077 is about to resolve in one direction or another. What none of them inherit is a blank slate. The pre-war world made specific choices about energy, about governance, about the relationship between corporate and government power, about who counted as worth protecting and who could be treated as a resource, and those choices shaped the specific form of the catastrophe that ended it, and the specific form of the catastrophe shaped the specific form of the world that came after it. The wasteland is not simply a neutral testing ground for human character. It is a specific consequence of specific decisions, and navigating it requires engaging with those decisions, understanding them, and either perpetuating them or breaking from them. The factions that recur across the franchise, the Brotherhood, the Enclave, the NCR, Caesar's Legion, the Institute, are all, in different ways, attempts to perpetuate or break from the patterns of the pre-war world. The Brotherhood perpetuates the military impulse to control technology through institutional authority, the same impulse that produced Vault-Tec and the FEV research it conducted. The Enclave perpetuates the governmental impulse to treat the population as a means, rather than an end, the same impulse that produced the Vault experiments. The NCR attempts to break from both by building democratic institutions, but finds that democratic institutions are subject to the same corruption and inefficiency that destroyed the pre-war democratic institutions, because the people in them are the same people, with the same limitations, in different costumes. Caesar's Legion is the most deliberately anti-modern response. The argument that the modern world's specific failures are the consequence of modernity itself, that the values which produced the resource wars and the Great War, individual rights, democratic governance, economic freedom, are the disease rather than the cure. Caesar's solution is pre-modern in a very specific sense. Organized violence, clear hierarchy, the subordination of the individual to the collective will, represented in the person of Caesar himself. The coherence of this as a political project does not prevent it from being wrong, but it does prevent it from being simply stupid. Caesar has thought through his argument. The argument is wrong, but it is not obviously wrong from inside the perspective of someone who has studied the pre-war world carefully and concluded that its core values failed it. The Fallout franchise never offers a faction that is simply right. This is a creative choice that reflects a genuine philosophical position. The problems of organizing human civilization are hard enough that no single institution has found the complete answer, and any franchise that presents one as having done so is either naive or dishonest. What Fallout offers instead is a spectrum of attempts, each with genuine strengths and genuine failures, each shaped by the specific experience and specific limitations of the people who built it. The player, moving through this spectrum, is invited to develop their own view not by being told what the right answer is, but by being given enough information to form one. This is the franchise's deepest gift. It treats its audience as capable of thinking through genuinely difficult political questions without needing the narrative to do the thinking for them. The question of whether the Brotherhood of Steel is a force for good in the wasteland has a different answer depending on which chapter, which period, and which criteria for good you're applying. The question of whether the NCR is worth supporting has a different answer, depending on whether you're a merchant benefiting from its trade routes or a settler whose community has been annexed without much consultation. The question of whether the vaults were a net positive for humanity depends entirely on whether you count the experimental subjects as human beings deserving of moral consideration, which turns out, when you put it that way, to not be much of a question at all. The mythology of the wasteland is ultimately a mythology about knowledge specifically, about the gap between what institutions claim to know and what they actually know, between what they claim to value and what they actually value, between the story they tell about themselves and the story that the people they affect would tell about them. Every major institution in Fallout has a public face and a private face, and the drama of the franchise is often the drama of the gap between those two faces becoming undeniable. The vaults claim to be shelters. They were laboratories. The Enclave claimed to be the government. It was a private club. The Brotherhood claimed to preserve technology for humanity. It preserved technology for itself. The NCR claimed to be a democracy. It was becoming an empire. The Institute claimed to be advancing human science. It was advancing its own power. None of these discrepancies were invisible from the beginning. They were hidden through institutional opacity and information control, and the tendency of people to prefer the comfortable story to the true one. The protagonists of the Fallout games spend their journeys discovering these discrepancies and doing what individual human beings can do about institutions that have decided their public face is more important than their private reality. Sometimes very little, sometimes quite a lot, always in ways that produce new complications for the next protagonist to inherit. Lucy McLean, walking through the Los Angeles wasteland in 2296, is doing something that the Vault Dweller did in 2161, and that the Chosen One did in 2241, and that every protagonist since has done. She is discovering that the story she was told about the world is not the story the world tells about itself, and she is figuring out what to do with that discovery. The franchise's bet is that this discovery that institutions lie, that the comfortable story is usually incomplete, that understanding what's actually happening requires willingness to follow the evidence past where it becomes comfortable, is both eternally relevant and worth exploring again in every generation and every medium. The bombs fell in 2077. The story is still going. The question the franchise keeps asking, what do you build after everything falls apart, doesn't have a final answer, because every answer produces a new situation that produces new questions. That's not a failure of the mythology. That's the mythology working exactly as intended. Life continues past the last page. The wasteland extends past the edge of every map. And somewhere out there, in the ruins of everything the old world built and the beginnings of everything the new world is building, people are still trying to figure out what they owe each other and what kind of world is worth leaving behind. That question doesn't have a cutoff date. It never will.